It all begins with the protagonist running through the forest, thinking he shouldn't be late on such an important day. But it doesn't take long for him to find his companions. Down, a C-rank hunter of the Watcher class, the guild's main tank, cannot believe that yet again a rookie is arriving late, remarking that things were different back in his day. Jimin, a C-rank hunter of the Fighter class and the guild's melee dealer, reminds the knight that he also used to be late all the time when he was a rookie, so he shouldn't complain. Shin arrives and awkwardly apologizes for being late. He is a rank 0 support of the Creation class, specializing in weapon crafting for the guild. Together, they walk toward the portal, and Dowan tells the protagonist not to be scared, saying he was just joking and that Shin wasn't that late after all, so it was fine. Jimin suggests they talk on the way, since Hyunwoo and Doyoon are already in position. Shin appreciates his companion's reassurances, but thinks to himself that things aren't looking great, as it's been 3 months since he joined the guild, yet this is his very first dungeon raid, and he's already late. As they pass through the portal, the group chats casually. The protagonist imagines that, being his first dungeon raid as a support, he must prove he's useful. Inside, he meets Doyoon, who asks if it's his first time in a dungeon. Doyoon is a B-rank hunter of the assassin class, a melee dealer, and the guildmaster. Nervous, Shin admits it's his first time as a support but says he's been in some dungeons as an assistant. Doyoon decides to give him some advice. He explains that supports don't have the combat skills of hunters, so they must be careful about positioning. Too close, and they risk getting dragged into the fight. Too far, and they won't be protected. The idea is to maintain a safe distance. The guildmaster tells the protagonist that, as a creator, he can keep a good distance and craft a dagger when Doyoon signals. After the explanation, Doyoon asks if the instructions were clear. Shin says yes, but asks if he should craft any other weapons. The assassin replies that he's the only one who needs extra weapons anyway, but reassures Shin that it's a simple dungeon and there's no need to overburden himself, so he can take it easy. Nearby, Hyunwoo reports sensing mana, indicating a monster is close. Hyunwoo is a C-rank hunter of the mage class and a ranged dealer for the guild. Doyoon tells everyone to prepare for battle and orders them to proceed in formation. He asks the mage if there are any specific observations. Hyunwoo states that he senses 3 small mana sources and 1 large one, likely the boss monster. Doyoon finds this odd, as a boss usually doesn't leave its area, but says it's fine, and that he'll handle the boss while the others deal with the smaller ones. He turns to Shin and asks how long it would take to craft a dagger if he rushed. The protagonist says about 20 seconds, but the weapon would only last for less than a minute. The assassin says that's perfect and tells him to start crafting, assuring him he'll take care of everything in 40 seconds. Soon, they encounter the group of monsters, which, in addition to the boss, includes level 0 crystal lizards. These monsters are born from mana stones that grow in dungeons and have appearances and abilities that vary depending on the type of mana stones they consume. Seeing the creatures approach, Down announces that he's starting. Using his strength, he slams his shield into the ground, creating a massive impact that sends the monsters flying. Jimin wastes no time, charging in to attack while the monsters are still stunned. She lands a powerful strike on the lizard, easily defeating it. However, after attacking the first creature and positioning herself to face the remaining ones, she notices that they heal faster than expected and warns her companions, who were heading toward them. Down was positioned for defense while Hyunwoo prepared his spell. It doesn't take long for the mage to start attacking, launching several fireballs at the lizards. Seeing the attack succeed, he celebrates with the knight, who suggests they help the guildmaster attack the boss now. Shin is impressed by his companion's coordination and admits that this is what a guild in action looks like. Doyoon begins requesting daggers from the protagonist, who, despite being distracted by the combat, had already started crafting, but knows he needs to focus more. The dagger is an F-rank creation, a basic ability of a creator that uses the user's mana to craft objects. The durability and quality of the item depend on the user's mana. Once the weapon is ready, Shin throws it to Doyoon, who catches it and activates his ability to transform it into an A-rank shadow weapon. This skill uses the user's weapon to transform it into a shadow weapon with enhanced quality and mana, depending on the user's mana. After a certain amount of time, it disappears. The assassin approaches the boss, who was about to attack, and with a single strike, easily severs the monster's head before the dagger disappears. Once it's over, Down asks the group if anyone was hurt, and everyone replies that they're fine. Seeing the guild in action up close, Shin thinks they are better than he expected, each one of them amazing, showing perfect teamwork. The protagonist imagines this group could become one of the best guilds with many achievements, but he feels that compared to them, all he had done was create a dagger, which wasn't much help. The protagonist begins questioning whether he deserves to be part of the guild until Do-yoon approaches and praises his work, asking if he was injured anywhere. Shin says no, but admits he didn't feel very useful. The guildmaster doesn't understand why the protagonist is saying that and explains that now they can save a lot of money by having someone to craft weapons. His ability consumes weapons, so he couldn't afford even the cheapest ones. That's why a creator is essential on the team, as all he needs is a weapon with mana to activate his shadow ability. After explaining this to Shin, Do-yoon tells him it was a great job crafting the dagger and that he's already looking forward to the next one, so he shouldn't think about leaving the guild. This cheers up the protagonist, who promises to do his best. The night approaches and says it's time to collect the loot, but suddenly the ground starts shaking. Jimin wonders if it could be an earthquake. Hyunwoo says he's not sure, as it feels like the cave is collapsing after they killed the boss. Shin alerts everyone that the wall is crumbling. The mage looks and says it appears to be a passage connecting to another area. After hearing this, the guildmaster wonders where the passage might lead. Down, thrilled by the prospect of treasure, exclaims that it could be a secret path to hidden treasure, and insists they can't waste time, and must go immediately. Jimin, sharing the knight's thoughts, agrees with his idea. However, cautious as ever, Hyunwoo urges his companions to remain calm, as they shouldn't rush in without studying the situation first. Do-yoon asks the mage if he can detect anything. The mage replies that he cannot. The assassin then concludes that it's fine, as it doesn't seem like the place will collapse after all, but they should move quickly. Do-yoon, now excited, charges ahead since the guildmaster has given permission. The mage, despite his doubts, says he will also go. Do-yoon calls Shin to join them as well. The group, excited, starts walking toward the hole in the wall, but unexpectedly, a massive monster appears, attacking everyone except the protagonist, who manages to run away. As Shin tries to escape, he wonders how this could have happened, since now everyone was dead except him. He can't understand how that monster was there, considering it should only appear in a D-rank dungeon. The protagonist admits he's never even heard of a monster that can't be detected by magic. Looking back, thinking he had managed to evade the creature, he is shocked to see it has already closed the distance. Before he can react, the monster attacks him from behind, hurling him far away. The blow to his back causes him to spit blood. Even so, Shin doesn't give up and tries to get up. Seeing the monster approaching, he thinks he can't die like this. Quickly, he starts crafting a dagger. As soon as the weapon is ready, he throws it at the monster, hoping to defeat it. But the dagger has no effect on the creature, which easily defends itself and counters by punching the ground. The impact shatters the floor, causing the protagonist to fall into a frozen lake. As he sinks, Shin reflects on how things have turned out. A D-rank support who can't even use basic buffs like healing, finally finding a guild that genuinely needed him, only to run away and abandon them when they needed him most, proving how pathetic he is. The protagonist admits that anyone else would have been more helpful, and he regrets ever awakening his abilities. This was a dream Shin should never have reached for. But just when he least expects it, a message appears. He has discovered the Code of Spring. With that, he has fulfilled all conditions to become a player. Following this, the protagonist begins to glow intensely until a welcome message appears, along with a notification of a new reward. Shin is overwhelmed, not understanding what's happening, and grows desperate in the situation. But with no other options, he accepts the proposal. A staircase is created within the water, leading him back to the hole from which he fell. Emerging from the water and facing the monster again, a message appears for weapon creator Shin, stating that he will inherit the experiences from his previous save. Energy radiates from his body, followed by a message confirming the reward distribution is complete. His eyes change, and now he feels stronger than before. Shin creates several swords and launches a relentless attack on the monster, giving it no chance to counter. As the creature lies on the ground, the protagonist feels confused, with unfamiliar memories fixed in his mind. But when he notices the monster moving to attack him again, he creates an immense shield to block the ice golem's powerful punch. He is impressed to see that the creature has sustained almost no damage from his attack, marveling at the golem's durability. It doesn't take long for the shield to shatter. Shin retreats, reasoning that if the information from these newfound memories is correct, the golem-type monster's weaknesses and tactics to destroy it should still be the same. A golem-type monster doesn't have any specific weak points. Even when it takes damage, it has a regeneration ability. Given this, the recommended strategy is to inflict damage from multiple angles simultaneously. Using himself as the ability's center point, he materializes a grid within a certain radius, allowing all creations within the grid to move freely according to his will. Shin crafts several swords and points them all at the monster, then launches a synchronized attack, striking all at once. The massive assault overwhelms and destroys the ice golem. The protagonist approaches the defeated creature and states that he initially thought the spatial grid was just a support ability to help him use his creations faster. But now he realizes that as the proficiency of the skill increases, it can be used as an attack ability in itself. A message appears stating that the boss has been defeated. However, Shin remains confused about why he cannot see the dungeon or monster information. Suddenly, an aura begins to form in front of him, and a message appears indicating that the passive ability, magic absorption, has been activated. An orb of energy gathers in Shin's hand, and he wonders what it could be. He decides to use his memories to try and understand what just happened. In his previous game, he had received the message, "Weapon Creator Shin, you will inherit the experiences of your previous save." After seeing this message, the protagonist wasn't entirely sure what it meant, but now he understands that he is himself from a few years in the future, and in that future, he had already lived. The entire world had fallen, along with horrors too unspeakable to describe. Beyond that, Shin had absorbed all the experiences and knowledge from that time. Knowing this, the protagonist admits that even if this is the future, it is probably not the future of the world he is in now. Too many things are out of place, such as the status window that he managed to summon before him. It displayed a list of his abilities: creation, connection, rent payment, and spatial grid. This was something Shin had never been able to see in his past life. With all this, the protagonist now recognizes that he has become a player, a term for the few who were chosen and underwent an awakening, according to his memories. In that era, players didn't exist in the world yet. Around 2 years later, a small number of awakened individuals were selected to become players, including the assassin Doyun, who was also chosen as a player. A blue screen appeared, visible only to those who had been chosen. In the future, this mysterious thing called the system, which initially seemed like a joke, was enough to shock all the awakened individuals in the world. The system wasn't the only thing given to players. Each player received a unique reward, powers, and abilities separate from those they had as awakened individuals. The system and rewards, these two sudden phenomena, allowed players to grow explosively compared to others. Thanks to the efforts of the guild leader, who was chosen as a player, the Dawan Guild, to which the protagonist belonged, was able to grow into a first-class guild. Shin didn't have direct involvement in this, but it became the catalyst for his growth in his past journey. To keep up with a developing guild, the protagonist repeatedly honed his skills with great effort. Now, Shin can check the abilities he has learned and their proficiency levels in the system window. Before, he felt pathetic when he first heard about this. The protagonist wonders if his skills and abilities from his past life have been transferred. Something feels different, as the abilities he used against the golem involved a skill he didn't even have in his previous life. It's called magic absorption, where he accumulates contaminated mana energy within dungeons. If the accumulated magic surpasses a certain limit, a new reward will be granted. Shin doesn't remember hearing about any player with such a skill, so he assumes it might be a unique reward given only to him. Still, regarding the ability to accumulate contaminated mana, he has a vague idea of how he obtained that magic. But Shin decides to think about it later, as right now, taking care of his friends' bodies is the priority. After some time at the Hunter Association headquarters, a woman looking out the window with her boss asks if she can dismiss Shin. Her boss questions the reason for such a suggestion. The assistant explains that it's suspicious, since a small guild had entered an unconfirmed dungeon, faced an accident, and 4 or 5 people died, leaving only a D-rank support as the sole survivor. Haruto acknowledges that if the support had fled while the other hunters were fighting, it would have been a type of betrayal. But that wasn't the case. The boy had cared for the bodies and even reported the incident to the association. Yuki adds that the portal had already disappeared, so any further confirmation was no longer possible. She seeks her boss's opinion, admitting that she finds the situation strange. Haruto asks if she's suggesting a D-rank support killed a hunter, then lightly smacks her on the head with a folder, telling her to wake up, as this isn't a police matter. Furthermore, he reminds her that, even if something strange happened, events in dungeons cannot be verified, and they can only gather evidence as it surfaces. Yuki recalls what her boss said and agrees that it's true. Haruto asks if she has any other theories, noting that such incidents have been occurring more frequently in recent days. Hunters disappearing after encountering a portal without reporting it. He explains that if they report the portal to the association and it goes to auction, the guild would only receive a cash reward. So instead, they risk their lives and enter secretly. Moreover, it's nearly impossible for small guilds to win a portal auction. As he prepares to leave, the boss tells his assistant to contact the boy if any additional investigation or developments arise. Yuki confirms she understands. While walking, Haruto reviews Shin's file and admits this case is unusual. even after saying all that. He understands the situation but can't shake the feeling that something odd is happening. He recalls his conversation with the boy, noting that Shin's demeanor during questioning was far too calm. Despite having little dungeon experience and witnessing a tragedy, he didn't show any signs of distress, which would have been expected. Additionally, there were some gaps in his explanation, even though he described the incident clearly. Still, Haruto concedes that this could simply be the boy's personality, as he's encountered similar individuals before. Yet, he remains convinced something is off, though he doesn't know what. The investigator finds it frustrating, but decides it's not something he can dwell on at the moment, though he resolves to examine the case more closely. Meanwhile, Shin walks through the city, reflecting on how strange everything feels. He can't understand the unconfirmed portal, especially since the dungeon didn't exist in his previous run-through memories. Moreover, all members of the guild had signed the portal bidding form, which was definitively stamped by the association. The protagonist considers that, with the dungeon listed as an unconfirmed portal by the association, it's possible someone impersonating the association deceived the Dawan Guild, or perhaps the association itself is involved. What troubles Shin even more is that this issue isn't isolated to the Dawan Guild. As the investigator mentioned, unconfirmed portals in cases of missing persons had already become a widespread problem. The protagonist doesn't know the whole story, but all the guilds in the news share one common thread. They involve players like guild leader Do-yoon and prodigies who would be hailed as heroes in the future. To Shin, it seems someone is behind all of this, trying to erase the existence of these heroes. So he decides that from now on, he must hide his abilities well to avoid becoming a victim, as he is now the sole survivor of a missing persons case that will remain unsolved. If he does anything suspicious, he might get caught. Shin knows he has about 2 years until the first selection of players to prepare. Therefore, he needs to mobilize every one of his abilities and develop them by that time. The protagonist thinks he must find a way to grow without attracting too much attention. He begins to select usable skills and soon finds one that might work. A year later, in the middle of a forest, Vikram fights a monster with his guild. But after striking the creature, his sword shatters against its shield and he suffers a counterattack, being thrown far away. Even so, the warrior manages to stop himself by stabbing the remaining piece of his sword into the ground, but notices the monster approaching, leaping to attack him. Vikram dodges but barely avoids being hit. He retreats near his companions who, like him, are terrified because they have no idea how to defeat the monster approaching them. The creature is a Null Lord with a D-level danger rating. A high-ranking Null has physical abilities far superior to regular Nulls. Their hide is not only physically tough but also reflective and immune to magic. Despite this, it is still sought after by hunters affiliated with magic. Vikram comments that a Null Lord in an E-rank dungeon should freeze to death, but he quickly recalls that even among D-rank monsters, this one is known to be incredibly hard to kill. The creature charges at them. The guild's knight rushes forward and manages to block it with his shield, struggling to hold it back, and says they won't last long if all they do is defend against attacks. Junseo tells Vikram that no matter what, he has to deal some damage to the Null, but the warrior is paralyzed with fear in the face of the situation. The Reaper of low-level hunters, as Null Lords are called, earned their name not just because of their superior physical abilities. Typically, monsters of this rank are weak to magic, so even the weakest group of adventurers relies on it. However, Null Lords defy this logic. Hunters who confidently rely on low-tier magic face fear for the first time, and the price of their arrogance and foolishness is often the complete annihilation of their group. Now, the protagonist's guild only has a physical damage dealer who is ineffective in melee combat, and his weapon is completely destroyed. Seeing his companion giving his all to defend the group, Vikram grows furious that he has no weapon left while Junseo is pleading for an attack. The dealer admits that if he had known it would be this hard, he wouldn't have been so greedy and would have assembled a larger team. He regrets his decision to minimize the party size and rely on hiring a single mage, which has now backfired. Vikram notices someone collecting crystals while they fight. That person is the helper, someone who doesn't participate in battle but is responsible for gathering and transporting subproducts like mana stones. As long as they have a basic ability to sense mana, anyone can take on this role. Among the awakened, helpers are treated and recognized poorly, essentially the jack-of-all-trades of the group. Vikram doesn't understand why they even have a helper on their team, but notices that his group is about to die, and the guy doesn't seem to care, continuing to focus on his task. Observing the helper, he notices their tool vanishing, and realizes it might be a creation ability. Even though he doesn't expect much in terms of quality, he thinks it might be their only option. The dealer calls out to the helper, who is Shin, and approaches him, asking if he's a creator, and if he can make swords. The protagonist says he can. Vikram replies that anything will do, but requests a sword that's as durable as possible. Shin apologizes and explains that he joined the guild as a helper, not as a support. This angers the dealer, who retorts that this is no time for such nonsense, especially when they're on the brink of death and, if they fail to defeat the boss, they'll all die. The protagonist takes a deep breath, begins crafting the sword, and states that he's willing to help, but under one condition. After they clear the dungeon, they must forget everything about his ability. When it comes time to pay his share, they should only pay the rate for a regular support. If they agree, he will assist. Vikram becomes furious and tells Shin that someone like him, who couldn't find a job as a creator and ended up running errands as a helper, thinking he can solve the dungeon problem just with weapons, is nothing but stubborn. After finishing the weapon, Shin smiles and replies that it's funny because good weapons are a crucial element in clearing a dungeon. The protagonist had crafted better weapons for everyone in the group and assures them that, as long as the dealer has the right tools, everyone will be able to clear the dungeon. Meanwhile, at Overkill Guild, one of Korea's top 3 guilds, the assistant walks into the guild president's office after being given permission to enter. She informs him that the Awakened Association has sent a cooperation request. Taehan asks if it's because of the ranking error in a dungeon. Hisu confirms this, saying that although it's framed as a cooperation request, it seems they're willing to pay any price. The president wonders if the association is out of options. The assistant explains that there are almost no awakened individuals capable of entering a forcibly closed portal. Seeing the report, Taehan recognizes Shin and recalls that he's seen him before. A few weeks ago, a dungeon with a ranking error appeared in Seocho, and Taehan happened to be dispatched to that area. Passing by the scene, he distinctly remembers Shin. According to the report, Shin was listed as a helper. Even if such occurrences are becoming more frequent, problematic dungeons with survivors are still rare, and the number of such cases can be counted on one hand. Taehan knows that this helper participated in a group where everyone survived, not once, but twice, and concludes this cannot be a coincidence. While the president is deep in thought, Hisu mentions that problematic dungeons seem to be appearing more frequently lately. Just a few days ago, a D-rank dungeon was reclassified as B-rank, and the entire group was annihilated instantly. Taehan comments that the Awakened Association must be dealing with quite the headache. Hisu adds that many people are criticizing the association since determining, analyzing, and announcing dungeon ranks is undoubtedly their responsibility. The guild president imagines the head of the association must be under immense pressure right now. He then tells his assistant that those in the guild with invasion abilities are generating more income, so they should take on a few extra commissions for the time being and simply observe the situation. Switching topics, Taehan asks what she found regarding the task he assigned her to investigate. Hisu reports that she couldn't find any weapon creators ranked A or higher, but mentions receiving a rank B weapon from a Japanese blacksmith. She asks if her boss would like to test it. Taehan declines, pointing out that she knows any weapon below rank A would be destroyed immediately upon using his ability, and even rank A weapons don't last very long. Rising from his seat, Taehan instructs her to keep searching for creators who specialize as supports, as he's reaching his limit with how quickly he's burning through weapons. The assistant agrees to continue looking but notices someone approaching. Jun bursts into the room and informs the guild leader that something has happened. Taehan walks toward Jun and asks what happened. The man explains that it's about the association's deployment request. He checked the location, and it was a D-rank dungeon where some rookies entered with a free attack team. The guild leader asks what rank was measured after they entered. Jun replies that it had been reassessed as rank C, which was significantly higher. Taehan states that he cannot risk losing his rookies, especially in such an urgent situation, so he will investigate personally. It doesn't take long for them to arrive at the location where the portal had appeared. There were many reporters, along with members of the association. Everyone was surprised to see Overkill Guild arrive. Reporters immediately bombard the guildmaster with questions about the continued errors in dungeon rankings, speculating that the Awakened Association was cooperating with Overkill Guild to gain access to dungeons. They also ask if his presence there is because members of his guild were part of the attack team in the dungeon. Taehyun says nothing, and approaches an association member who looks concerned about the situation. The woman thanks him for coming, saying she hadn't expected him to show up in person. The Overkill Master asks about the situation. Jin, the association member, explains that the attack team consists of their hunters, 2 supports, and a helper, all qualified beyond the necessary requirements. However, those qualifications mean little since the dungeon was reassessed as rank C. Taehan asks how long it has been since the team entered. Jin replies that it has been about 2 hours. Surprised by how much time has passed, Taehan comments that he doesn't know how many people might still be alive but promises to do everything he can. Jin thanks Taehan for his bravery. The guildmaster drops the suitcase he was holding and extends his hand toward his assistant, who begins pulling a sword from her bag. She is a B-rank support of the subspace bearer class. The secretary of the Overkill Guildmaster has the ability to create a subspace in enclosed areas. Hisu hands the sword to her master, which ignites as he activates his skill. With a single swing, and using his invasion ability, he cuts through part of the portal that was blocking their entry. This ability allows him to forcefully open paths by breaking through mana barriers, including gates. However, when entering another dimension, the invasion ability is triggered. After using the sword, it breaks, and Taehan hands it back to his secretary, who advises him to be careful. He then picks up his suitcase and steps through the portal into a chamber. Feeling the temperature and humidity, coupled with the foul smell, Taehan deduces that it must be a reptile. He also notices the absence of pollutants on the ground, which suggests a creature with a certain level of intelligence and reasoning. Given the dungeon's classification, the answer is clear. This is a den of lizardmen. These monsters are classified as D-level threats. They are humanoid reptiles that live in tribal units. Compared to other humanoid monsters, they have considerably longer lifespans, with intelligence and combat power proportional to their age and experience. As he moves through the dungeon, Taehyun analyzes the size of the group and its combat strength based on the lizardmen corpses and the degree of suffering noted in the report. He concludes that the team might already be dead, as the worst-case scenario cannot be ruled out. However, upon reaching the team's location, he sees something completely unexpected. The group is fighting on equal footing with the lizardmen, holding their ground all this time. Watching the battle, Taehan deduces that something is allowing the group to hold their ground, as the lizardmen's movements and speed indicate they are much stronger. With such a gap in strength, it's unlikely the group would last this long. Taehan soon notices one of the monsters disarming a warrior, leaving him vulnerable to an attack. He admits it's too late for him to intervene. Suddenly, something blocks the lizardman's strike. A sword materializes above the combatant, preventing the attack. Taehan, advancing to assist Young, stops in his tracks upon witnessing this and wonders if it might be magic. He quickly corrects himself, recognizing it as a crafted weapon, and begins to question who made it. Looking back, he sees it's the helper he bumped into some time ago, who is actively creating those weapons. Approaching Shin, Taehan asks how many people are inside the dungeon. Shin replies that, including those in combat, himself, and the guildmaster, there are 10 people. Surprised, Taehan remarks that he remembers only 9 entering, and then asks what Shin is doing there if he's just a helper. Meanwhile, the group struggles to defeat the lizardmen. Akiram is struck and about to be finished off by a monster when Taehan intervenes, using his super speed to assist. Observing this, Shin admits he didn't expect the Overkill Guildmaster to personally join the rescue. He also notices that Taehan carries a weapon he hasn't used yet, suspecting it might be a spare. The protagonist watches the fight closely, acting only when the time is right. Taehan arrives just in time to block the lizardman's attack. Locking swords with the creature, he orders the rookies to retreat. The mage thanks him for the save. Taehan faces the monster with ease, igniting his sword with a flame ability and delivering a series of rapid strikes that leave the lizardman no chance, ultimately defeating it. Without pause, he moves on to the next creature and dispatches it just as easily. Taehan admits to himself that he hasn't even used his full strength yet, but recognizes that the B-rank weapon he's wielding feels far too weak. As he contemplates this, another creature charges toward him. Using his super speed movement ability, Taehan easily cuts down the lizard, defeating it without much effort. Standing next to Shin, Taehan asks if his sword always suffers such severe wear and tear when using his ability, calling it a terrible waste. Shin, unfazed, asks if Taehyun is looking for a fight. Without responding further, Shin creates a new sword for the guildmaster and tells him to use it, but warns him not to break it. Taehan is impressed by how effortlessly Shin materialized the weapon with a single gesture. He realizes that Shin is not just an ordinary weapon creator, but someone exceptionally skilled and competent. However, Taehyun now wonders why someone of such ability is acting as a helper. He recalls hearing about low-class supports often struggling financially and taking on helper roles out of necessity. Shin picks up the master's old sword and sets a condition. After clearing the dungeon, he wants everyone to forget about his ability. Taehyun responds that he won't forget just because Shin asks. However, as Taehyun holds the sword, it begins to dissolve. Shin warns him that if he doesn't want the new weapon, he can go ahead and destroy all his high-level weapons. Even while saying this, Shin internally acknowledges that the weapon he created will likely break as soon as Taehan uses his ability again. But that's not a problem, as he can simply make more. Now, understanding Shin's intentions, Taehyun promises to forget everything. Satisfied, Shin tells him he can use the weapon however he pleases. Wasting no time, Taehan charges at another lizard man, activating his fire ability. With a single strike, he shatters the monster's weapon, leaving it completely vulnerable. He is impressed because he had only planned to dodge the attack, but the opponent's weapon broke first. Taehan admits that his control over the weapon felt far greater than usual, and on top of that, the sword was incredibly strong. Now he is even more intrigued by the weapon creator, who can instantly craft a weapon that is at least above B rank, finding it fascinating. Realizing the monster is about to strike him, Taehyun uses his incredible speed to counterattack first, increasing his strength output to test how much the sword can endure. Taehyun drives the sword into the monster's stomach, unleashing a powerful burst of flames. Pulling the sword out, he rests it briefly on the lizard man's shoulder, moves behind it, and plunges the blade into the creature's neck, igniting it entirely. After retrieving the sword, the monster collapses to the ground, coughing up a large amount of blood. Taehyun examines the sword to check its condition and is astonished to see that it doesn't have a single scratch. This means he would have to use his full strength to damage it. While Taehyun is analyzing the weapon, he is interrupted by a priest expressing gratitude for his arrival, along with Yunseo and Min, who thank him for saving their lives. Taehyun responds that he's relieved no one was injured. They explain that they couldn't fight effectively with their own weapons but managed to hold off the lizard men thanks to the helper. Taehyun looks at Shin, who is quietly placing crystals into his bag, approaches him, and asks his name. The protagonist replies that there's no point in learning the name of a mere helper. The guildmaster insists, saying they should at least know each other's names to communicate, then introduces himself. The weapon creator, noticing the master's keen interest in getting closer, stands up and gives his name. Akaram, overhearing, says he will leave the monastones at the portal entrance. The dealer agrees. Taehyun then tells Shin that they're heading to the boss room and instructs him to leave his things there. The protagonist hesitates, saying he's just a helper and might not be very useful. Even so, the swordsman grabs Shin's bag and hands it to Akiram, stating that since the dungeon's ranking has become erroneous, if they don't defeat the boss, no one will be able to leave, be they helper or support. Shin remarks that Taehyun is more than capable of defeating the boss alone, but Taehyun insists, explaining that no weapon can fully withstand his ability. No matter how skilled he is, breaking the weapon he received would be pointless. The weapon creator confidently states that there's no way a sword crafted by him would break. The master, already heading towards the boss room, tells the protagonist that this is what he had expected, but that dungeon was classified as an error class. The creatures inhabiting that place were monsters far beyond ordinary lizard men, so no precaution would be excessive. Shin agrees to go with the swordsman, leaves the remaining bags on the ground, and starts walking alongside Taehyun. It doesn't take long before they reach the boss room, a place filled with traps. The master and the protagonist face the Lizard King sitting on his throne. This creature had a danger level of C, being the final form achieved by a lizard man after over a century of surviving successive skin shedding. Despite its small size, its strength and speed far exceeded those of a regular lizard man. Taehyun tells Shin that in such cases, the best approach is to disregard all existing danger levels and information, think positively, and aim to finish things as quickly as possible. After activating his fire ability, he adds that if they took too long, the weapon might even break. Hearing this, the protagonist is unimpressed, especially since he had claimed the weapon wouldn't break, and retorts that if the master didn't trust the sword, he should just try it. It doesn't take long for the Lizard King to rise and point his weapon at his opponents, ordering his monster to attack. Fiercely, the creature charges at Shin and Taehyun, who manage to dodge the attack with relative ease. The swordsman wastes no time and attempts a counterattack, but the monster senses it and starts defending itself, using its tail to spin violently. The master steps back to defend himself from the wind attack created by the giant lizard, but quickly reacts and launches another attack. Before Taehyun can get close to the creature, the Lizard King also advances to attack, locking his spear in the air and preventing the master from moving forward. After their weapons clash, the lizard man retreats and mounts the creature. Taking the reins, the giant lizard begins to breathe fire and unleashes a powerful attack. The master is taken aback by this move and doubts he can defend against it, but Shin creates a shield with just one hand, protecting Taehyun. Immediately after, the monster charges at the swordsman, who manages to defend himself and retreat to counterattack. Impressed by the shield Shin created, the master asks if he isn't merely a weapon creator. The protagonist replies that a shield can also become a weapon. Taehyun activates his fire ability and says that once they leave, he has several questions for Shin. He then uses his super speed to attack. The Lizard King throws his weapon, attached to a chain, at the swordsman, who blocks it with his sword. However, the chain wraps around the sword, and the boss attempts to drag the master straight to the demon lizard's mouth. Shin tells Taehyun to stop fooling around and fight properly, making the sword wrapped in the chain appear in his other hand. The swordsman responds that he's just testing the weapon, and with the sword now in his other hand, he successfully strikes the monster, leaving it unable to defend itself. The Lizard King, stunned by this, doesn't expect Taehyun to throw his sword, nearly hitting the boss's neck. They stare each other down closely, and the swordsman, now without his weapon, kicks the creature, sending it flying. After the Lizard King falls to the ground, the master doesn't wait for a reaction. Now armed with his flaming sword, he attacks, leaving his opponent nearly defenseless. Taehyun lands a powerful strike, managing to sever the enemy's arm. Still refusing to give up, the Lizard King notices Shin is retreating and seemingly unarmed. He grabs his spear and charges at the protagonist, only to have his attack blocked by a shield. This leaves the creature bewildered. Shin asks the boss who he thinks he's pointing that weapon at. The monster gets distracted by the protagonist and forgets about Taehyun, who, engulfed in flames, finishes off the opponent. Outside the dungeon, reporters and association agents are gathered. They notice the portal beginning to open and start speculating whether the group inside had succeeded. It doesn't take long before Taehyun and the group of rookies emerge from the portal. Reporters immediately swarm the master, asking about the dungeon's interior and details about the boss. However, he doesn't respond, and instead approaches Hisu, who asks her boss if he's injured. The swordsman assures her he's fine, and smiles as the priest and Min thank him once more for saving them from that situation. Meanwhile, Shin hands over a bag filled with magic stones to the attack group leader, stating that he's leaving since he already received his payment in advance. After delivering the bag, the protagonist glances at Taehyun, who is giving an interview, and slips away before anyone notices him. A reporter asks the master how he managed to clear the dungeon so quickly. Taehyun replies that it wasn't just him, but when he looks for Shin, the latter is nowhere to be found. The protagonist's friends, knowing he dislikes the spotlight, step in and tell the reporters that everyone contributed to blocking the monsters as a team, allowing the master to defeat all the creatures. The archer agrees with Junseo's statement, and the knight adds that all his weapons were destroyed, showing one as evidence, emphasizing how dangerous the situation had been. He praises Taehyun again for arriving and defeating all the monsters. The master turns to the knight, grabs him, and demands to know why he's saying that, insisting that the weapons lasted because of Shin, who kept creating them so they could fight for so long. Yunseo feigns ignorance, as if he doesn't know what the master is talking about. Taehyun persists, clarifying that he's referring to the helper, the weapon creator, but the knight still refuses to acknowledge Shin's contribution. Taehyun then asks if they knew that the helper was a support capable of creating weapons. Yun says she isn't sure if the helper did all that. Taehyun questions others, asking if they saw the helper making weapons, but everyone continues feigning ignorance to protect Shin. The assassin even claims that the helper didn't even have a pickaxe. The master, confused by their behavior, recalls Shin asking him to forget about his abilities once they left the dungeon. This realization frustrates Taehyun further, as he struggles to understand how the protagonist could use skills exclusive to rank A or higher creators. His assistants, noticing his distress, ask if something is wrong. Taehyun tosses his weapon bag to Jun and rushes off to find Shin. The assistants are left baffled, as he says nothing. Taehyun searches everywhere for the weapon creator but can't find him. He eventually stops running, scanning the area and unable to locate Shin, and waits for his assistants to catch up. Hisu asks her boss if something is wrong. The swordsman replies that he needs her to find someone and begins describing the protagonist. A few days later, in the Overkill Guild building, Hisu enters the master's office and reports that she has located Shin. She reveals that around 1 a.m., Shin entered a dungeon near Songpa with a group of 5 members. Taehyun commends his assistant for her good work and notes that the dungeon isn't far from their current location. Hisu, feeling awkward, tells her master that she has a question. She asks why there is so much interest in Shin, considering he is just a rank D creator. Hearing this, the master asks his assistant if that's how it seems, but admits that it's natural for people to think that way without knowing him first. Taehyun begins reviewing the weapon creator's data, including status, history, and all available information, which indeed classifies Shin as rank D. However, the skill rental payment alone disproves everything. This skill, ranked A, allows for the materialization and leasing of objects, and can compel a request from the lessee. with the scope and compulsion depending on the user's capabilities. The master acknowledges that this is a high-rank skill he's never seen in use before, yet he finds it strange since such a skill could lead to immense wealth, but is being used merely to conceal Shin's identity. Taehyun admits he could never have imagined a weapon maker reaching such a level so easily, but he knows he will only find answers by meeting Shin again. The master reflects that he has never felt anything like what he experienced when wielding a weapon made by Shin, finally being able to use his full power without worrying about the weapon breaking. Having tested swords made by numerous renowned blacksmiths, considered the best in their field, Taehyun recalls how activating his skill against monsters always broke the weapons, often during the first attack. This left the blacksmiths bewildered, unable to craft a weapon strong enough for him. None of them met his expectations, leading Taehyun to believe that creators' crafting abilities were limited to normal-grade weapons. However, the weapons Shin had crafted in the dungeon far exceeded those limitations, as though such restrictions didn't exist. The master speculates that if Shin's abilities truly have no limits, it might finally be possible for him to use his special skill, which he's been unable to utilize due to the lack of suitable weapons. Taehyun knows that clearing a rank D dungeon typically takes a 5-member group about 4 hours, and the creators group is nearing the final hour of their clearance. Eager to meet Shin, the master asks his assistant about the rest of the day's schedule. Hisu informs him that at 7 p.m. he has a meeting with the master of the Hyunmu Guild. As he walks out of the room, Taehyun tells her to cancel the meeting because he plans to leave early, determined to avoid missing any chance of finding Shin. Meanwhile, inside the dungeon, the knight battling a monster can hardly believe the weapon he's using was crafted by a mere helper. With that sword, he managed to destroy the boss's weapon, meaning it could be of rank B quality. The knight admits that when his own weapon broke into 2 pieces, he thought his group was doomed and never imagined the helper had such a skill. Minho marvels at his new sword, claiming he has never seen a weapon of such quality before. He thanks Shin for helping him and mentions that if Shin doesn't belong to a guild, they would recruit him. Sujin agrees, expressing that it's a shame someone of his talent is working as a helper. The protagonist, carrying magic stones, overhears the group's conversation and admits to himself that he didn't expect to use so much mana. He hadn't imagined encountering a group that would struggle so much, even though this wasn't an error-class dungeon. As he gathers more magic stones, Shin notes that if he hadn't conserved his mana, the group likely wouldn't have survived. Shin acknowledges that the incredible amount of mana he sensed within the dungeon earlier, after defeating the golem and using all his strength, never truly disappeared. Now, what he feels isn't better than the mana of a rank D awakened. However, it's a relief that he didn't face any major issues while creating weapons. Shin didn't expect that memories from his past life would help him in such a way. Knowing that a creator's basic skill is creation, which assists in producing a specific object, and that the quality is proportional to the mana used, there's another method to enhance the performance of this skill that the protagonist is yet to fully understand. When crafting a weapon, the proficiency level matters, such as when creating a sword through the method of heating metal. The higher the understanding of the object being crafted, the better its quality. The best aspect of this skill is that the quality increases along with mana efficiency. Thus, even if Shin uses the same amount of mana to create the same object, a higher level of understanding results in significantly better quality. After this hidden aspect of the skill was revealed, the protagonist recalls undergoing intense training, researching materials, receiving training from a hunter as a support, working in workshops, and attending weapon crafting classes. He feels like he has more mana than he expected, though he's not entirely sure how much better he has become. Compared to the mana being utilized, the resulting quality isn't just an add-on, it's something beyond normal, even though it still lacks in certain areas. Shin admits it's challenging to use the creation and rental payment skills simultaneously, and mana-related equipment is expensive, so acquiring them is out of reach for now. However, he can at least procure mana potions, the only mana-related item that can be mass-produced. Shin realizes he should request more potions, even though his low pay as a helper makes this difficult. He even considered becoming a creator officially, but no one would accept him as a rank D support, so he decided to remain a helper. Checking his passive skill window, he finds the results promising. His skill, mana absorption, allows him to accumulate contaminated mana energy found in dungeons. If the accumulated magic surpasses the limit, a new reward will be granted. The protagonist notes that he's close to reaching the absorption target, only about 20% away. Shin admits that clearing a few more dungeons won't suffice, as each removal only increases absorption by 1%, which is far too inefficient. The only viable method left is to enter an error-class dungeon to absorb a significant amount of mana at once. Compared to other dungeons, error-class dungeons offer several times the mana absorption rate. Shin already has a location in mind, but the issue is that he can't predict the difficulty of the error or the dungeon's rank before entering. He acknowledges that the previous dungeon would have been challenging without Taehan's presence. To avoid surprises, he knows he must prepare to face at least a rank C boss, and understands that his only path to growth as a rank D awakened is to check the mana absorption reward. It doesn't take long for the group to leave the dungeon. After crossing the portal, they bid farewell, promising to meet again soon. Shin feels satisfied, knowing he erased their memories so they wouldn't recall what he had done. However, when he least expects it, Taehan immediately recognizes him by his voice and turns to face him. The master approaches alongside his assistant and asks the weapon creator if he remembers him. Shin is shocked to see that his memory-erasing skill didn't work on the swordsman, but tries to play it off, claiming he doesn't remember him. Taehan hands a card to the protagonist, just in case Shin truly doesn't recall him. Shin asks what business they need to discuss. The master says it's a serious matter and requests a bit of his time. The protagonist notices that the card is from the Overkill Guild, one of Korea's top 3 guilds. Although tempting, he realizes he can't get involved with such a large guild yet, so he thinks of making an excuse and leaving. After deciding this, he turns and says he doesn't have time, as he already has a dinner planned. Taehan places a hand on his shoulder, saying Shin won't regret the conversation they're about to have, and that it won't take much time. Plus, dinner will be on him. Shin replies that as the guildmaster, Taehan must have a lot on his plate, so he didn't expect him to take time out to talk to a rank D helper. Taehan agrees, but says he has his reasons. Although Shin doesn't like where this is going, he needs to confirm how well rental payment worked, so he brushes past Taehan and says he'll give him a bit of his time, even if it's brief. This excites the swordsman, and they head to a restaurant to talk. While eating, Shin asks what business the Overkill Guildmaster could possibly have with a rank D support like him, doubting it's just idle chatter. Taehan explains that his class is Berserker, and while it boasts overwhelming attack power, there's a limit to how much he can use because no weapon can handle the full force of his strength. He goes on to say that the most critical task for a Berserker is to find a weapon supplier who can match their needs. Taehan has visited countless places to achieve this, both domestically and internationally, starting with blacksmiths renowned as the best in their fields and even the few weapon creators out there. If there was even a sliver of possibility, he would commission weapons without worrying about time or money. Yet, every weapon he's obtained so far has failed to endure his abilities fully, except for one, the sword Shin gave him in the dungeon. Hearing this, Shin realizes one thing for certain: rental payment didn't work on Taehan at all. Furthermore, he admits he was careless, as he didn't expect the Berserker class to have a style-nullifying ability. Now, he recognizes the need to be more cautious when using his skill on high-level hunters. Taehan, speaking directly, asks if Shin would be interested in joining the Overkill Guild, noting that he isn't part of any other guild. If Shin accepts, Taehan promises he'll receive the best treatment, including a signing fee of 10 billion won, plus separate payments for operational expenses and debt repayment. The contract would last 1 year, with a 10% increase in the signing fee for each renewal, and the specific details would be outlined in the contract. Shin apologizes and stands up, stating that he has no plans to join a guild at the moment and will have to decline. He thanks Taehyun for the meal and says that if there's nothing else to discuss, he'll take his leave. Taehyun is stunned to see Shin walking toward the exit after rejecting his offer. Hisu asks her boss why he made such a generous proposal, considering it was unusually high for a rookie, and points out that it's unlike him to make such an offer without a reason. Taehyun tells his assistant that if she had experienced what he felt when wielding that weapon, she wouldn't speak like that. He explains it's been a long time since the cry of a weapon reached his fingertips. When he held that sword, he could feel it truly accepting and enduring all his power. But it wasn't just the sensation that was appealing. Taehyun also had to consider the sheer number of high-level weapons he had destroyed that year. Hisu acknowledges that the Guildmaster's expenditures on weapons were astronomical. Regardless of the weapons breaking due to their inability to handle the pressure, if they weren't of a certain rank, Taehyun's abilities couldn't even be fully unleashed. Thinking about all this, she concludes that, if what the weapon creator had achieved was truly possible, the proposed hiring fee was hardly excessive. However, the problem was that, until then, no one had been able to create such a powerful weapon, not even the so-called best in their fields. Taehyun insists that he is certain Shin can craft such a weapon and that, no matter what it takes, he is determined to recruit him at all costs. Outside the restaurant, Shin admits to himself that he never thought the day would come when he'd reject an offer to join one of Korea's top 3 guilds, especially Overkill, led by Taehyun, who would undoubtedly be an excellent ally. Still, Shin feels it's too soon for him to join any guild. He reassures himself that it's fine. He can wait patiently because without a doubt, the guildmaster will find him again. A few days later, a dungeon raid is underway. Several goblins have already been slain by a group that is now under attack by an executioner. Of the attacking group, only one knight remains, watching in horror as his companions are killed like they're nothing. Frightened, Sung asks the executioner who he is. The man replies mockingly, saying this is always a memorable moment. By the time he's killed everyone else, most people are usually crying, begging for their lives and losing consciousness. Laughing, Dong-hae says he is someone who will become a different kind of hero. Sung asks why he's doing this, or if his goal is simply to kill everyone for their trophies. The executioner responds that it's for a rather dull reason, one he won't bother explaining, as it would just be a waste of energy to someone who's about to die. However, he adds with a laugh, he might explain if Sung somehow manages to defeat him. Laughing louder, Dong-hae tells Sung to attack quickly if he doesn't want to die. The knight realizes his opponent isn't easy to handle and knows that, from a safe distance, he'll be killed for sure. Resolved to lose a limb if necessary, he charges to attack. Sung delivers his strike, but it's blocked by the executioner. Nevertheless, the knight doesn't relent and continues his assault. Dong-hae, however, deflects the attacks with ease. Eventually, he disarms Sung, knocking his sword from his hand. As Sung stares at his fallen weapon, he fails to notice the executioner closing in for a kick. The attack lands squarely, sending the knight flying into a wall. Stunned and defenseless, Sung clutches his stomach, winded by the powerful blow. The executioner approaches, dragging his sword along the ground, and expresses his disappointment. He says he had been excited, as it was the first hero rank domination in a year, but he never expected his opponent to be such small fry. Looking at the sobbing knight, Dong-hae remarks that his courage is admirable, and, as a reward, he'll send him off clean. Raising his sword, despite Sung's desperate pleas for mercy, the executioner strikes him down, ending his life. After killing Sung, Dong-hae muses that he had hoped for a real fight after such a long time, but it wasn't even enough for a warm-up. Looking at the lifeless body, he mockingly says the knight's expression of injustice is priceless. With sarcasm, he adds that Sung shouldn't worry. His death will be reported as a heroic battle against the boss, where he bravely fought and died with honor. As he takes pictures of the bodies, Dong-hae comments that this is normal for a problematic dungeon. Scrolling through the photos, he smirks, pleased that his collection has grown, and remarks that he truly lives for collecting these images. Suddenly, the executioner feels a chilling energy that sends shivers down his spine. He tells the priestess to tone it down or at least announce her presence when entering. Hana apologizes, explaining that she rushed in because she heard there were some precious ingredients in the area. Dong-hae sarcastically asks what precious ingredients she's referring to since everyone in that group was just a bunch of fools. As she walks past him, he remarks that he had told her not to listen to those people and to wait a little longer. In a dark tone, Hana asks if the executioner is planning to go against the wishes of the mysterious person they follow. Dong-hae simply tells the priestess to make sure everything is cleaned up properly. Hana, already using her abilities, assures him that cleaning is her specialty. Still in the room, the executioner reminds her not to forget her promise to let him fight an S-rank hunter, as that promise is the only reason he's sticking around with her. He complains that, because of her damned conscience or whatever it is, he's forced to kill people cleanly and can't even use his full power. While casting her spell, Hana tells him not to worry, promising she'll make contact soon. The executioner says that if that's the case, it's fine, and asks which creature will emerge this time. A massive monster begins to rise from the ground, leaving Hana in awe. Once fully summoned, the creature tells Hana that what the executioner said wasn't wrong. Meanwhile, outside the portal, the association is blocking the passage to prevent people from entering. Shin is already on site, waiting for the right moment to enter, when he spots Taehan wearing a cap and mask to avoid being recognized. They begin talking, and the protagonist asks what Taehan is doing there. The guildmaster jokes that Shin must have sharp eyes to recognize him so easily. Shin replies that there's only one person he knows who carries a weapon bag like that, then asks again why he's there. Taehan explains that he's there to clear the portal. Confused, Shin asks why a guildmaster would be interested in attacking a D-rank portal. Taehan responds that the guild member assigned to this portal got sick, so he's filling in. Shin finds this explanation odd but can't ask more questions as the attack team announces their entry. Even Taehyun calls him to join. Shin didn't expect to run into Taehyun again so soon and realizes he'll have to adjust his plans. After passing through the portal, the guildmaster walking beside Shin asks why he doesn't just join the guild. Shin replies that he's already rejected the offer and doesn't want to discuss it further. As they proceed, Shin overhears a conversation between a knight and a mage discussing a rank C portal auction that took place in Chuchan that morning. The mage, Minji, mentions that her friend attended the auction and said the bid Hyunmu Guild placed was so high that no one else could compete. Shin begins to wonder why Hyunmu Guild would pay such a high price for a rank C portal, and whether they've discovered something. Taehan, overhearing the conversation as well, asks Shin if he's interested in buying portals. He adds that if Shin were part of Overkill, he could easily acquire special portals above rank B. Taehan explains that Overkill members enjoy hidden privileges thanks to the guild's name alone. For awakened individuals, a guild's reputation is significant, as it can bring public admiration and even envy. Beyond that, guild membership provides access to lucrative jobs, unparalleled earnings, and rewards far beyond what other awakened could hope to achieve. Additionally, with these rights, members can claim various benefits. For example, with high-rank special portals, they can even obtain entry tickets. There was significant influence not just through talent, but through the dynamics of politics and structure, which naturally led to rare treasures from such places being confiscated by larger guilds. Taehan tells Shin that he must have some goal he's aiming to achieve as an awakened. Whatever it may be, with Overkill's support, it would be easier to reach. He admits he doesn't understand why Shin is rejecting the offer so vehemently. The weapon creator replies that it's none of his business, and adds that he can somewhat understand Taehyun's persistence, since probably no one has ever refused an invitation to join Overkill. He clarifies firmly that no matter what happens, he will not join any guild. This leaves Taehan deep in thought, considering whether Shin's attitude stems from the trauma of the Daewon Guild's annihilation, or if it's something else he's hiding. Regardless of the reason, Taehyun resolves not to give up. The group delves deeper into the dungeon until spiderwebs begin falling around them. Kitai announces that they are now entering the monster's territory, and as most of the hunters seem to be rookies, he gives a quick briefing. While everyone should have read the reconnaissance report, the monsters here are legion spiders. Although their individual danger level is low, they have special traits, notably that they live and fight in groups. According to reconnaissance, there are about 50 of them, not too many. Another important detail is their paralyzing venom, so everyone needs to avoid being bitten. As Kitai gives his explanation, Shin notices Taehyun drawing his sword and advising Shin to stay close, as the creatures are approaching. Shin dismisses the concern, telling him not to worry about the helper and focus on preparing to fight. Taehyun counters, stating that all combatants must protect the group's helpers and support members, as it's a rule hunters must follow regardless of skill or situation. When Shin starts to argue that no hunters ever follow such rules, Kitai alerts the group that the spiders are approaching. The team gathers, ready for battle. The giant creatures close in all at once, causing Minky to tremble with fear. Despite his shaking, he urges the group to stay calm, reminding them they can take the spiders down if they stick to what they've learned. Legion spiders, with an individual danger level of E and a group danger level of D, change their threat level depending on the size of their legion. The rookie group grows tense as the spiders get closer, ready to strike. Even though he's scared, Minky is the first to kill one of the creatures, landing a solid blow that splits it in half. Kita uses his shield to create a barrier, blocking the spider's advance, while Minji attacks from a distance using her magic. Taehan observes the rookies fighting and concludes that, for rank D members, they're not bad, so he doesn't need to intervene yet. Shin, looking behind them, is shocked to see a massive swarm of spiders. He remarks that this is far more than just a few dozen. Taehyun readies himself for combat, activating his flame ability before the spiders get too close and launching an attack against the massive group. As he fights, he notes that the durability of Legion spiders is relatively low even among classified monsters. He realizes that, at this pace, he could likely clear the dungeon without breaking his weapon, as he only needs to release a small amount of chi. Mid-battle, the rookie group calls for help after becoming surrounded. Kitai panics upon realizing there are at least a few hundred spiders rather than the 50 they were expecting. Minky says this is going to be harder than he thought. Minji adds that she's almost out of mana and doesn't know how much longer she can hold on. Seeing the group in danger, Taehan starts running toward them to help and calls for Shin to follow. However, the protagonist walks in the opposite direction, telling the master to assist the others and that he would follow once he was done. Taehan, confused, doesn't understand, as there are even more creatures in the direction Shin is heading. As Shin walks, a spider charges at him. Taehan yells for him to duck, worried that Shin might be overwhelmed if he carelessly uses too much chi on his sword. But to Taehan's shock, Shin blinks and, in an inexplicable move, slices the spider in half. Taihan is left speechless, impressed by such skill. Shin, meanwhile, reflects that of all the weapons he could currently create, the sword was the most refined and effective. Ideally, he'd summon multiple swords and launch them all at once against the spiders, but that's impossible with his current mana reserves. Accepting this limitation, he admits that the sword he created is the best option for now. With just a finger, Shin controls his magical sword, guiding it to attack all the approaching creatures without moving from his spot. Effortlessly, he adjusts the sword's direction with a simple gesture, killing every spider regardless of their position. The final creature falls directly in front of Taihan, who is astounded by the large-scale attack and the fact that it took just 10 seconds to completely annihilate the legion of spiders. Taihan, still processing what he witnessed, wonders how Shin managed to use materialization in combat. He realizes he's dealing with a talented support who can also fight. Shin breaks the silence by asking Taehyun why he's standing around when the rookie group is in trouble. Taehyun snaps out of it, seeing the rookies struggling and nearly overwhelmed, and says they'll talk properly after the situation is under control. Before Taehyun charges into battle, Shin casually tells him it's fine and reminds him to come up with an explanation later. No one would believe a helper defeated all those creatures. Taehyun says nothing, activating his skill and heading into the fight. After they finish off the monsters, the knight thanks Taehyun, saying they survived thanks to him. Sitting on the ground, Kitai remarks that he didn't expect Lee to be someone so well known and never imagined he was the master of overkill. Taehyun apologizes for not revealing his identity earlier, explaining that he was there to investigate the dungeon discreetly. Minji, puzzled, asks why he's apologizing when he saved everyone. She begins to flirt with him, saying it was so cool to watch him handle all those spiders, and asks if she can take a picture. Before Taehyun can respond, Minky returns, interrupting her moment. Frustrated at the lost opportunity, Minji glares at Minky. Minky apologizes for the delay and explains that he and Shin were collecting subproducts while making their way back. He also reports that the area seems clear of monsters and mentions they found another path nearby. Kitai then suggests they stop the raid, saying it's bad luck and they shouldn't proceed any further. Minky, confused, asks why his partner is suggesting they quit. Kitai explains that the number of spiders they encountered and the dungeon's geography are entirely different from the reconnaissance report. He elaborates that dungeons exist beyond portals, separate from the real world, and are places filled with bizarre creatures and unique geographical features that don't exist on Earth. At that time, the concepts of dungeons and awakened beings were not yet perfectly established, so the most important thing for those who had just awakened was information about these places. There weren't many awakened who could adapt to dungeon environments they had never encountered before, which often led to failed raids and, in the worst cases, death. This is how the concept of scouts emerged. Awakened individuals with abilities to detect and conceal their presence came together and began taking on reconnaissance commissions for dungeons. The success rate of dungeon clearances started to rise significantly after these reconnaissance efforts, and these individuals became known as scouts. Kiti explains that the accuracy of a reconnaissance report is usually over 98%, so claiming this was just an error is unlikely. However, they also couldn't rule out the possibility that this was a problematic dungeon. Minky grows tense after hearing Kitai's explanation and says that since they have the guildmaster with them, it should be fine to continue. Kitai acknowledges Minky's desire to press on, but points out that receiving the guildmaster's help once is already a privilege. If they're not careful, everyone could end up in danger. Even with the knight's insistence, Minky said he really wanted to clear the dungeon, as he needed money. Minji was in the same situation and didn't want to give up either. Kitai asked if this was truly the most important thing in their lives. He reminded the group that once they entered the boss room, they couldn't turn back and should first report to the association. This comment left the team more worried. Unexpectedly, Taehyun reassured them, saying he was fine with it since his purpose there was to investigate, and he still considered himself part of the group. He explained that if he could reach a conclusion by advancing the invasion, there was no reason not to proceed. To complete his investigation, he would need to enter the boss room regardless. Shin stayed silent, observing the group's reaction. Kitai bowed to the knight and thanked him for his help without hesitation, adding that he believed the knight should obviously be the leader due to his greater experience. Taehyun dismissed the matter, urging the knight to continue leading as they had done from the start. Kitai agreed and suggested they move forward, asking everyone to follow him. After some time navigating the dungeon's corridors, they arrived at the door leading to the boss room. The knight began delivering his final briefing, explaining that the boss of this dungeon was the Spider Queen Legion, classified as a D-rank threat. Her combat abilities were generally low, and she was considered an easy boss. primarily spawning legion spiders. As they prepared to open the door, Kitai noted that this was the original intel, but they couldn't be sure what creature lay beyond the door. Once ready, the knight opened the door. Upon entering the dark room, Minji provided light for visibility. Taihan observed the space and noted no unusual signs, which momentarily alleviated their concerns. Kitai, leading the group, warned them to prepare as the boss was approaching. Minky and Minji were relieved to see that it was indeed the Spider Queen they had been briefed about, with no apparent changes. Minji volunteered to strike first. Using a long-range electric attack, she managed to hit all the creatures in one go. However, when the effect of the spell subsided, she was stunned. The boss had died from a single attack. Kitai, astonished, declared he had never seen anything like it and advised the group to fall back. Suddenly, they felt a different presence, freezing the less experienced members in place. Above the fallen Spider Queen appeared a new monster, Arachne, a B-rank threat. Known as the queen of all spider monsters, Arachne possessed high intelligence and cunning. She didn't reproduce but expanded her territory by overtaking other spider monsters' domains, augmenting her legions through raids. Arachne could also share her power with her followers. Her menacing aura terrified the novices. Before they could react, Arachne launched an attack. Taihan countered, activating his flame ability and striking with his sword. The knight was shocked, never expecting a B-rank monster to appear. He admitted that an unrefined sword strike wouldn't even leave a mark, and with the weapon already breaking, he resolved to inflict as much damage as possible in a single blow. Taihan delivered a direct strike to the monster's abdomen, wounding it, but shattering his sword in the process, leaving him unable to deliver a finishing blow. Immediately, Arachne counterattacked. Taihan, defenseless without a weapon, was about to be struck when Shin stepped in, creating a sword to block the attack just in time. Protecting the group, the weapon maker told Taehyun to make do with the temporary weapon while he forged a proper one. However, as the protagonist began crafting the new weapon, he realized he had completely exhausted his mana. While taking a mana recovery potion, Shin admitted that it was incredible he had lasted this long with the low mana level he had. As for mana potions, he could manage to drink 1 bottle a day, since anything more could lead to addiction. However, the effects were still amazing. The time it took for him to drink the potion delayed him in helping Taehyun with the battle, but he still managed to create a sword in time to block the attack, and buy some time to forge a more decent weapon. Shin acknowledged that Arachne, a B-rank monster, was a high-level creature, but the real problematic boss that was supposed to appear was the monarch spider, a C-rank. Looking at the novice group, who were terrified by Arachne, he recognized how lucky they were to have Taehyun with them. It would have been difficult to face that boss with such an inexperienced group, especially once the threat level reached B. The monsters changed. Arachne kept attacking the master, who stood firm, blocking all the fast and powerful strikes. Watching the swordsman fight, Shin noted that his pure combat power was equal to that of 5 A-rank hunters. But when considering Arachne's abilities, they couldn't just rely on the master. So, it was up to the novice group to rise, now that Arachne's bloodlust had shifted focus. Kitai, impressed with Shin's weapon-making abilities, asked who he was. Minky and Minji were also surprised, not expecting someone so talented to be acting as a mere assistant. The protagonist replied that there was something more important they needed to deal with first. Creating new weapons for the group, he told them to choose between taking the weapons in front of them and clearing the dungeon by defeating the spiders or retreating and waiting outside until the situation calmed down. Before they made their decision, he said he trusted they would make a wise choice. The novices didn't hesitate for long and chose the weapons, deciding to join the fight. Minky, wielding his new sword, marveled at it, as he had never held a weapon like this before. He found that he was now defeating the monsters with incredible ease, as if he were cutting through paper. This surprised him, as he hadn't expected monster hunting to be so effortless. In the middle of the combat, Minky noticed that Minji had started using her long-range powers, which were impressively strong. Kitai was amazed, realizing that the only change had been the weapons, yet the power of the girl's abilities had increased several times over. Seeing how easily the spiders were being defeated, the knight began to wonder how Shin had created such good weapons so quickly. What intrigued him even more was that Shin was a weapon creator but was calling himself an assistant. Taihan, despite struggling in the fight, managed to wound the creature with great difficulty, but he acknowledged that this was to be expected from a high-level B-rank monster. He also admitted that it was getting harder to find the right moment to strike. The creature started to roar loudly and resumed attacking the swordsman, who activated the flames on his sword to defeat Arachne as quickly as possible. The monster realized that the swordsman was close to striking and attempted a counterattack, but it wasn't enough to stop the master's blow. With an increased strike power, Taehan managed to split the creature in half. Taehan admitted that the sword was better than he had expected, seeing that his strike had increased in power and the sword hadn't broken. However, he soon noticed that smaller spiders were starting to appear. The novices were startled by the massive swarm of monsters, especially since they had no idea where they were coming from or where they were going. Kitai pointed out that the spiders were heading toward the master. Taehan, seeing that the creatures were moving in his direction, ordered the group to retreat, and he recognized that things were getting complicated, especially now that Arachne's ability was being activated. The swordsman observed that Arachne was sacrificing the spiders and transferring their life force to herself. This meant that she would repeat this process every time she was severely wounded. The boss was now healed and surrounded by several spiders, regenerating. Taehan, preparing an attack, thought that he needed to increase his firepower and finish everything in one blow. But before he could strike, his sword, powered only by his chi, broke. Shin told the master that he was even more incredible than he thought, as even with the little mana he had, he never imagined he would actually destroy a sword. Now, the protagonist created an even more powerful weapon and asked the swordsman to use it, even though it wasn't a two-handed sword like he usually wielded. However, it was a more durable weapon. Shin explained that this was the best weapon he could create at the moment. Taehan felt that as soon as he held the new sword, he could defeat all those creatures at once. He admitted that he wasn't familiar with this type of two-handed sword, but it was the most appropriate for the situation they were in. The master gripped the sword and used his explosion skill, further increasing his power. Now fully prepared, he charged at Arachne, and with his immense flame power and strength, managed to defeat the boss and the spider minions in the area. Seeing the explosion skill that the master had used, Shin recognized it as a natural ability of a berserker. It was probably the first time the swordsman had used it correctly. Instead of gaining overwhelming power, this skill resulted in the user losing all rationality. Taehan easily cleaved Arachne in half after releasing all his immense power, causing a massive explosion of flames. It didn't take long for the master to calm down, and once the flames subsided, he admitted that what he had done was extremely dangerous. He acknowledged that if he hadn't released all his power, his reason might have been consumed. Since this was the second time it had happened, after his awakening, he had managed to use the skill correctly. After using the powerful weapon, which had been created with minimal mana, Taehan admitted that he had been wrong. Shin was not a normal awakener. He realized that once the ability Shin had was discovered, everyone would focus on him. The protagonist approached the dead creature and noticed that the immense amount of mana it exuded was unlike any of the other problematic dungeon bosses. He then asked the swordsman if he felt anything from the corpse. The master replied that he definitely didn't feel anything and that it was dead, as he had taken care of all its remains. Arachne would not come back to life. After hearing Taehan, Shin now knew for certain that even a high-level hunter couldn't sense the mana the boss exuded. So he activated his passive mana absorption skill and began draining the energy. As he was absorbing it, a window appeared, indicating that the accumulation of contaminated mana had been completed, and he received a reward, a new skill, demonic weapon creation. This was an active skill that, when using 100% of the accumulated mana, allowed the user to create weapons from the demonic realm. The total amount of accumulated mana was 150, and the number of demonic weapons saved was 0. A demonic weapon created once would be saved and could be materialized without any further mana consumption. This skill could be used once per day, with a duration of 10 minutes. After checking his new ability, Shin wondered what a weapon from the demonic realm would be like, as he couldn't even imagine what kind of weapon it might be. At that moment, he couldn't recall any concepts of the demonic realm, but it could be all the ones he already knew, so it wouldn't be too big of a problem. But the protagonist admitted it was a pity that the reward wasn't related to mana, though it was still fine. He was happy, as looking at the mana absorption skill window, he noticed that, thanks to Arachne, he had reached half the required mana. It also seemed that the rewards wouldn't stop there. Taehan called Shin over and said he had something to say. The protagonist turned around and asked what it was. The master said that first, he wanted to apologize because, despite Shin's rejection to join the guild, he had kept asking him to accept the offer. That was rude, regardless of his duty as a guildmaster. Therefore, he wanted to apologize, as he was truly regretful. Shin didn't understand why Taehan was bowing and apologizing, leaving him speechless. Kitai, who had been watching this scene, couldn't believe the swordsman was bowing to a D-rank helper, but he soon thought that, based on the skills Shin had shown, he definitely wasn't a normal person, and the assistant might be a hidden talent of the Overkill Guild. since creating all those weapons was really difficult. Minky, along with Minji, approached after confirming that there were no more monsters in the area. The young man stated that there were no creatures left, as it seemed the boss had gathered them all. Minky told Minji that the weapon was incredible, as it could kill monsters without using up any energy. Minji said she had never seen a crafter make weapons like that before, and because of it, she was starting to think that Shin might be with the Overkill Guild. While they were talking, the knight was about to urge them to leave and contact the association. Minky, feeling awkward, asked if there was any specific reason they had to leave. The girl wanted to thank Taehan and Shin first before leaving, but Kitai started pushing his companions, telling them to get out of that disgusting place already. While the knight tried to convince his friends to leave, he thought it was certain that the assistant was related to the Overkill Guild, and that it would be best to leave as soon as possible. After all, if they interfered in the affairs of a large guild, things could get troublesome for them. However, no matter the emergency, Shin had fascinating power. Meanwhile, the protagonist told the master that they could talk now, as, even if he used the rent payment, a guild master shouldn't be bowing in front of just anyone. Taehan told the weapon maker that his guild would no longer try to bother him and that he would stop following him, but that didn't mean they were giving up, since this was the first opportunity, and he wanted to know if Shin would be interested in signing a contract, as he was sure he would like the new conditions. After leaving the dungeon, they headed straight to the Overkill building. Shin sat in the office with Hisu, who said it was good to see him again, and introduced herself as the official secretary of the guild. She mentioned that she was in charge of the contractual procedures and was at his disposal for whatever he needed. The protagonist told Hisu that the master had said he would contact him immediately, but he hadn't expected it to be the very next morning. The secretary explained that Taehan had requested things to move as quickly as possible, which is why there was a sense of urgency. Shin asked where they were, as he felt like he had come from a very distant place. She replied that this was the special reception room inside the Overkill Guild, a location with particularly strict security, and if he was worried about leaks, there was no need. She placed the contract on the table and asked Shin to read it, as it contained the terms the guildmaster had mentioned earlier. And even though it might take some time, they could also change the contents of the contract, so Shin could read it carefully and feel comfortable expressing his thoughts. As he read through the contract, the protagonist realized it was exactly as Taehan had said back in the dungeon, but now it felt real, seeing everything organized in this way. Shin placed the contract on the table and told them to proceed with it as it was. The conditions the master had proposed were for the weapon maker to be an unofficial support member. The swordsman said to the protagonist that he vaguely understood why Shin had been against joining a guild. It was because, for some reason, he needed to hide his identity, and if that was the case, the offer they had could be a great help. Taehan said that Overkill could secretly provide Shin with any materials he needed, equipment, ingredients, and portal rights, no matter what it was. But they needed to proceed with a contract for the sake of formalities, and everything would be kept secret. After hearing these conditions, the protagonist asked the master why he was being so kind. Taehan replied that he was doing this, but not for free, since Shin would need to help fulfill the personal requests they gave him. However, the swordsman added that he wouldn't force anything, and if he didn't like the request, he could refuse it. The protagonist then asked what Taehan would do if he received support but didn't reciprocate. Taehan said it would be fine, since the purpose of the contract in the first place was to establish a connection with the guild and prevent the weapon maker from joining another guild. Accepting a commission was nothing more than a symbol of sincerity. When the master finished making his offer, men from the association's investigation team entered the room and were surprised to see Taehan's state. The swordsman, wanting to remain as discreet as possible, told Shin that they needed to leave and that he would be waiting outside for his answer. Additionally, he hoped it would be a positive response, although there was no need for Shin to feel pressured. Before they left the dungeon, Taehyun's last words to the protagonist were that the skill he possessed was worth more than the value of the contract. Now, about to sign the contract, Shin thought that according to his original plan, he wanted to leave a strong impression on Taehyun and maintain a relationship with the Overkill Guild without actually joining them. But now, regardless of that, the agreement between them seemed very good, so he decided to sign it. After signing, Shin asked the secretary when he could start receiving support. Hisu said that he could receive it right away and just needed to let her know what he needed. The girl then took out a gift from the guildmaster as a celebration for the contract signing, mentioning that she had heard it was a useful item found in Arachne's lair. Shin took the box in his hand and wondered what the gift could be. Upon opening it, he was surprised by what he saw, but quickly stored it in his backpack. He then handed Hisu a list of the support materials he wanted. While she was reading the list, the protagonist asked how long it would take to receive all the items. The girl said that the amount was possible to be delivered within a week, though it might be a bit over the limit, but she didn't think those materials would be much help for a support role. Shin agreed, saying that she was right and that he wouldn't use them, instead giving them to someone else. Then, he left. The next day, the protagonist was back at the Overkill building, checking the time on the clock, thinking he might meet someone at that hour. It didn't take long before he ran into Gia, the rank A hunter. Inside a dungeon, this woman could easily defeat high-level monsters. After the player selection, she became a prodigy hunter, known as the Goddess Archer. When Gia arrived at the guild building, she headed straight to the information desk. As she approached, Gia said she was there to request entry into a training portal and handed her card to the attendants. Seeing that she was a rank A hunter, the attendant asked if she could arrange a rank C training portal. Embarrassed, the archer replied that it was better not to, and that she preferred a rank D portal instead. The attendants didn't understand why she would want a lower rank portal, until they realized that it hadn't been long since this hunter was evaluated as a rank A awakened, and that she had very little experience, having entered portals only a few times. As Gia was filling out the paperwork, she mentioned that she had seen lower-ranked awakened ones completely give up being hunters after only using low-rank portals, but she had never seen a rank A hunter like this. While Gia was signing the papers, the attendant thought that this hunter would probably be demoted if she kept going like this. The first rank of an awakened is based on the total amount of mana they possess. When the blue energy poured out from the cracks, the mana flowed into everyone's bodies, but the amount of mana each person could absorb was different. The more mana a person's body can hold, the better their abilities. The association then began analyzing the mana quantities of everyone, creating regulations for those who absorbed more than a certain amount of mana, who were classified as awakened. Furthermore, they began dividing people into ranks based on the amount of mana, but it was clear that the rank wasn't fixed. Even if someone was ranked low, they could improve their performance through dungeon invasions, and if recognized by the association, could be promoted. But of course the opposite could also happen. Gia finished filling out the form and handed it to the attendant, who said she would help her with the application. First, she asked the hunter if she had a partner to enter the dungeon with. Gia replied that she didn't. The attendant said that she would place Gia on the partner recruitment list, as the rules required her to enter with a group of at least 2 people, and since there were no requests for rank D training portals, she would have to wait. Embarrassed, Gia asked if she really couldn't go alone. The attendant said it was possible if she had a permit to solo the portals, but to obtain the permit, she would need to pass a test. She then asked if Gia wanted to register for the test. The archer replied that she didn't need to, and would just wait. Before Gia left the room, the attendant told her that she needed to inform her that the first hunter qualification renewal she would go through would be in a month. She probably saw, through the notifications, that to renew a rank A hunter qualification, one needed multiple experiences with rank C portals or higher, or pass the actual rank A test. The attendant added that, in Gia's case, she would most likely need to take the test, but she would receive a message about it soon. Shin, who had been nearby, witnessed the entire scene and was waiting for the right moment to talk to the hunter, who seemed tense, thinking that even requesting a training portal was complicated and that she should have done it online. Gia didn't like going to places with many people, but she had made the decision to come here with the mindset that she couldn't afford to be demoted, so she needed to pull herself together. After all, it was just a rank D portal, and what happened last time wouldn't happen again. While still in the room, Gia noticed she received a message, but it seemed odd, since the attendant had said she would wait. However, upon reading the message, she realized it was for a rank D portal, as she had expected, so she accepted it as quickly as possible to avoid missing the opportunity. She headed straight to the location where the portal was open, where several people were already gathered. When she arrived, she felt nervous, as it had been a while since she had entered a portal, and every time she experienced an uncomfortable sensation. Before she entered, Shin approached and asked her name, introducing himself as a support and suggesting that they could work well together. She bowed and told the protagonist it was a pleasure to meet him. Embarrassed, the weapons creator apologized for being late and said they could go in now. Shin knew that Gia was a hunter of the archer class, initially estimated to be rank A. However, after her continued failures in tests, she was one of the few awakened individuals who were demoted to rank C. The reason Gia had received the title of archery goddess was because, after being chosen as a player, she was able to discover her hidden talent. Shin knew what that talent was, something a person could uncover even without becoming a player, and that was why he was determined to awaken Gia's talent that day. After they entered the dungeon, It didn't take long before they encountered a group of monsters in the middle of the forest. The archer was hiding behind some bushes, observing the movements of the goblins. She was testing a device she had brought with her, which allowed her to sense the mana of a monster. Ready to attack, she apologized to Shin and said she wanted to go alone. She then asked if it would be a problem for her to kill the creatures without his help, but she assured him not to worry, as she would split the loot and compensate him after finishing. The protagonist said it was fine, and that she didn't need to worry, but if she needed help, he could provide her with arrows. Jia thanked Shin and stood up, pointing toward her target. While aiming, she tried not to get nervous like before. Now more focused, she was able to hit the first target, drawing the attention of the other two goblins, who were already armed with bows and arrows, preparing for a counterattack. But Jia was determined to do her best, and before the creatures could attack her, she fired another arrow, successfully defeating another goblin. Watching Jia fight, Shin remarked that it had been a long time since he had seen her in combat, especially after she became a player. Jia possessed pure destructive power, which made her a rank A hunter, but that power was useless because she couldn't aim with precision. While attacking, the archer admitted that out of 3 arrows she shot, she usually hit one, and that was her best record. She thought that, at the pace she was going, she would be able to shoot at least 4 shots in a row and finish things in just 2. But before she could attack again, she noticed the goblin was blowing a trumpet, calling more creatures to the area. Her device, which showed the mana of the monsters, started beeping, making her even more nervous, to the point where she couldn't shoot, and was surrounded by the creatures, paralyzed and doing nothing. She was now lost, unsure whether to shoot forward or backward, or if she should do something else. Frozen in place, she could only watch as the monsters closed in on her. But Shin created several swords around Jia, preventing the goblins from getting any closer. He then approached and asked if she needed help. Seeing this, Jia asked if he wasn't a rank D creator. The protagonist acknowledged that she was right but said he could still help. Jia admitted that she couldn't last long on her own and was in need of assistance. She then asked what she should do in this situation. Shin pointed to the forest and told her to shoot an arrow in that direction, using all her power. Jia listened to the weapons creator, even though she didn't know what he was planning. After she fired the arrow, she asked what she should do next. Shin grabbed her arm and said that she had cleared the way with the arrow. Now they had to run because there was a large group of goblins behind them. The girl didn't understand what was happening, but she began to run. After running for some time through the forest, they arrived at a mountain with an entrance. Exhausted from running, Jia said that she was glad they had survived the goblin attack, but now she wondered where they were, noticing that they hadn't escaped from the creatures. However, looking back, she saw that the goblins couldn't get any closer, as if there was something preventing them from advancing. The archer admits that her mind is overwhelmed and that she can barely keep up with everything happening around her. She also doesn't understand why Shin is so calm in a situation like this and thinks they need to get out of the dungeon as soon as possible. Embarrassed, the girl tells the protagonist that she was supposed to go on this mission, but in return, she'll hand over whatever she said earlier without any problem. Shin tells her they can't leave yet, because since the goblins are still on high alert, they'll likely remain in the area for a while. After explaining this to the archer, the weapons creator says he had dropped the rescue signal while they were running, so they had no choice but to wait until the goblins moved away. This made Jia even more tense, as now they didn't even know when they'd be able to leave the place. The protagonist says it might take a day, but depending on the situation, they could be waiting even longer. This leaves the girl desperate, thinking that they were really screwed now. Shin, seeing Jia in such a state, didn't want to tell her it was all a lie, that the goblins would move away in about half an hour since they weren't very coordinated monsters. He said that although his reasoning was a bit exaggerated, Jia seemed like she would believe everything. But now, the biggest problem was convincing the girl to enter the cave. Given her fear, it was doubtful she would actually go in. While the protagonist was thinking of a plan, Jia approached him and began to apologize, saying it was all her fault. She explained that if she had fought the goblins properly, none of this would have happened. She also said she shouldn't have said she would go alone in the first place, and that's why she was genuinely apologizing. The girl began to tremble and cry, thinking she had caused more trouble, as she hadn't expected to be in this state in a rank D dungeon. She started blaming herself even more, thinking she shouldn't have entered the dungeon at all. Shin told her to pull herself together and said that if she truly felt sorry, she could make one of her requests. Jia asked what request that would be. The protagonist told her they had plenty of time, so they could talk while exploring the cave. As they walked, the girl didn't understand why the weapons creator needed her help. Even though she was rank A, she had little experience with dungeons and didn't fully understand what Shin was saying about the elite monster. Shin explained to the archer that since this was her first time in a training portal, It made sense she didn't know much, especially since this information wasn't very well known. He went on to explain that instead of having a boss monster in the dungeon, there was a monster below that rank, called an elite, and this cave was its habitat. For personal reasons, the protagonist needed to defeat the creature, but up until that point, he had been unable to, and he still couldn't fight it. After explaining this, the protagonist told Gia that she was the first person to accept his support in the group. After saying this, Shin noticed the archer's behavior had changed, and he thought he might have made her uncomfortable. Though she didn't respond immediately, the girl said she would help the weapons creator, if he was okay with it. Gia thought it was the right thing to do to help Shin, because, thanks to him, she had managed to escape the dangerous situation she had been in. Plus, she knew firsthand how painful it was not to be able to join a group, so she was determined to help. Suddenly, her item detected mana from a nearby monster. The protagonist used his lantern and spotted the approaching elite monster. Gia asked Shin to stay back while she prepared to attack. The girl thought that, even though it was an elite, in the end, it was just a monster from a rank D dungeon, and if she could just hit it, maybe once, they could defeat it. The archer fired an arrow directly at the chest of the giant goblin, but it easily blocked the attack with its club. Gia was surprised to see this, as she hadn't expected the monster to defend so effortlessly. Even so, she prepares another arrow, thinking that she had been wrong and needed to shoot with all her power. But as she aimed, she began to tremble and think negative thoughts. This left her paralyzed, just like every time she started to panic. After a moment of being frozen, she realized the monster was about to attack. Shin, staying alert, grabbed her and threw her back to protect her. The goblin swung its club, and from where the archer was, she couldn't tell how her partner was faring. This made her think of her past, when people from the group she had been part of belittled her for not being able to shoot arrows properly, sometimes even nearly hitting her own teammates. No matter how much she apologized for her mistakes, they didn't understand, accusing her of making excuses instead of genuinely apologizing. The reason for this was that she had been evaluated as rank A. Gia remembered that the members of her old group didn't like her at all, both because of her mistakes and because of the rank she had received. No matter where she went, people treated her like a failure because she couldn't even kill a monster. They also said she was a waste of talent, as she was rejected even in rank D groups. Gia lived with these negative memories, which now made her think she should have given up a long time ago. For this reason, she thought Shin might already be dead. But then, the weapons creator appeared, saying that acting wasn't his part, and wielding a sword, he attacked the monster, drawing its attention. He told the archer that what he was about to say wouldn't make sense, but she needed to listen carefully, because if she calmed down and followed his instructions, they could win. Shin had set the board in a desperate situation, and all that was left was to buy time. He asked Gia to carefully observe the monster, as she would be able to see something. The protagonist was drawing the creature's attention so it wouldn't block the attack. He then told the girl to shoot an arrow with all her power, and that would defeat the monster. But Gia was trembling, as it felt like all her senses were on edge, which was extremely uncomfortable. Even so, she didn't give up, and managed to see something different. Now, she could clearly see where she needed to aim. She prepared the arrow, and when she opened her eye, she was able to aim perfectly to end the situation once and for all. She fired a powerful shot at the monster, which, realizing it, tried to defend itself. Shin realized that the archer had finally activated her abilities properly, as the activation conditions were strict. Without any reason, Gia's arrow pierced the goblin's club, easily killing it. Seeing that, the protagonist thought that this had been a very effective way to help the girl awaken her abilities. The arrow tore off the monster's arm and created a massive hole in its stomach, which was enough to prevent it from continuing to fight. The girl was exhausted after the battle, having to overcome her own senses and use all her strength. Shin approached her and said that the feeling of expanding her senses through her body would be different, and while this method was a bit extreme, it was necessary for that feeling to bloom within Gia. After hearing that, the girl asked the protagonist who he was, because it seemed like he had predicted everything, and besides, she didn't understand anything about awakening. Shin told her not to rush, as they had all the time in the world to talk. Gia asked him not to change the subject and to answer directly, but before she could finish speaking, she felt a sharp headache, to the point where she couldn't stay conscious and passed out. The protagonist didn't let the girl fall, and instead carried her on his back to take her out of the cave. While doing so, he thought that making allies was difficult, but at least he had managed to solve one problem. Outside the cave, Gia regained consciousness and began apologizing to Shin, saying she didn't understand why she had acted that way, as it felt like she wasn't herself. Still, she couldn't believe she had been so rude to someone who had saved her twice. The archer kept apologizing for what she had done. Shin, now feeling a little awkward, reassured her that it was fine since no one had gotten hurt, and moreover, they had defeated the monsters. Now, she could calm down. Despite crying, Jia nodded and told the weapon creator that he was right. Once she had composed herself, Shin asked if she could return the necklace he had given her earlier, before they entered the cave. Jia started searching her pocket, and after a moment, handed it back to him. Shin noticed that the color of the stone had changed, confirming that the girl had definitely used the item. The item was called Meteoric Sensation, a rare item that could only be obtained in the Rank A dungeon, Refuge of the Flaming Harpy. The ability of this item was to enhance the senses. When specific conditions were met, the ability was automatically activated, rapidly increasing the wearer's senses beyond human capacity, allowing them to perceive things from another world. However, there was a catch. The conditions were difficult to meet. The user's emotions had to be pushed to an extreme, which meant that for someone with Jia's personality, the best way to activate the item was by using an intense fear. That was why Shin had orchestrated the situation to make her terrified. Although it was a challenging method, as long as the protagonist could manage it, it would be impossible to awaken Jia otherwise. Despite the high cost of the item, it was rare and hard to find on the market, and Shin had almost given up on this approach. He had decided to ask Taehan for help, but never imagined he would manage to get the item in less than 2 days. Thanks to him, everything had gone smoothly, but this was just the beginning. Jia had only experienced the awakening through the item. Now, she needed more practice to reach the level she had once achieved. Shin asked the archer to listen carefully and explained that her first task was to create a situation where she would need to focus solely on the monsters. To do that, she needed to switch her bow. Since she had considerable power, there shouldn't be an issue with swapping from a short bow to a long bow to shoot from a greater distance. The protagonist told the girl that it was natural for her to interact with fewer monsters until the situations where she felt scared started to diminish. But besides that, there were other things she needed to know. Jia looks at Shin and thanks him for everything he had done, for the necklace that had helped so much. The girl says that when she thought she had died without accomplishing anything, something different happened because of the necklace. It felt like everything around her had stopped, allowing her to hit anything and even see where she needed to aim, as if a target had been marked on the monster. The archer is sincere and says that even though she holds an A rank in name, in terms of personality and everything else, she was no different from a D rank. And even if she tried to change that, she wouldn't be able to, and her disappointment with herself would only grow. Moreover, she felt like she had grown so much in a short period of time after meeting Shin, and that she was now a capable person who could be objective. For the first time, she had become excited for herself. After telling the protagonist all the truth, the girl says she had said too much and really just wanted to say that she needed help. The creator says it would indeed be difficult for her to manage on her own, so he would give her his number, and if she needed him, she could call at any time. Jia thanks Shin for doing this for her and says she will also give him her number. While they were talking, the protagonist receives a message from Taehyun asking to get in touch, saying it was an urgent matter. Shin decides to call him after leaving the room. The master was at the Hunter Association headquarters and had just managed to contact Shin, who had already exited the dungeon. Taehyun says to the weapon creator that he wanted to talk to him more after the meeting he was about to have. The protagonist says he would help, and that the item he had received had been very useful. The master says it's a relief that the item had been useful, and thanks Shin for agreeing to help him. After they finish their conversation, the swordsman waits for his assistant to arrive. It doesn't take long for him to hear Hisu approaching, and after entering the room, the girl says the president of the association has returned, and now they could leave. As they walk down the hallway, the assistant wonders if something unusual is going on, and asks her boss if this is an abnormal situation, since usually the association only sends official documents. It would be unthinkable for the association president to summon them in this way. Taehyun also finds the situation strange, but doesn't say anything to Hisu, who mentions that the commissions the president had sent through official documents were very difficult, and the reason for the summons might be the appearance of an S-rank portal. After noticing her assistant's concern, the master reassures her, saying everything is fine because Shin had agreed to help. Besides, if he fights like he did last time, there won't be any danger at all. The swordsman admits that it was the right decision to form a connection with Shin. Seeing her boss like this, Hisu notices that his mood had improved after the Arachne dungeon attack, and the reason might be because of the creator. The girl remembers that the protagonist had been acting strangely since the moment he signed the contract, as she didn't understand the concept of unlimited support, because she never imagined the guildmaster would give such a shocking condition. Even though he was a berserker, a class that makes it harder to control emotions. He was more intentional and level-headed than anyone. So, for him to be acting this way, the creator might be more capable than she had thought. But she still had doubts because there was no way someone of D rank could create a weapon that would satisfy the master. However, since Taehyun didn't talk about Shin often, the girl decided she should research more about it on her own. After they arrive at the president's office, there is a security guard at the door who says it's a pleasure to meet Taehyun and asks if he is alone. The master doesn't understand what the man is trying to say, so he asks if there's anyone else who should be there. The security guard replies that, from what he had heard, 2 guildmasters were supposed to appear, but if Taehyun was alone, he could go in first. Taehyun asks if he could know who the other master at the meeting was. The man begins to smile and says that the other master had just arrived. The swordsman and his assistant look to see who it could be. It's Yi-hyuk, who, upon entering, tells Taehyun that he knew he had been quite active lately. Hee-soo knew that this was the only person who could make the guildmaster angry. Yi-hyuk approaches the swordsman and says, "I'm the guildmaster of Overkill, you idiot." Seeing the loudmouth like that, Taehyun thinks to himself that this is going to be a hassle. The purple-haired man continues insulting the swordsman, trying to make him lose his temper. But the master of Overkill places his hand on Yi-hyuk's chest and says that he wasn't free enough to tolerate such ridiculous provocations. The loudmouth tells Taehyun that he must be deliberately choosing to wander through low-rank dungeons, and that's why he's like this. Hee-soo asks the purple-haired man why he's saying that. Yi-hyuk responds, saying she knows, because there were some coincidental cases where problematic dungeons appeared, and Taehyun entered with the intent to participate, not to rescue people. This leaves Hee-soo irritated, but her master notices and asks her not to do anything foolish. To avoid further insults, the swordsman asks the security guard to open the door so they can enter. The man opens the door and informs the president of the association that both Overkill and Shinhwa guilds had arrived. Cheolmin says he can hear them arguing and that they're the same as always. While the masters are in the room with the president, Hoon asks Hee-soo if she would like a cup of tea while they wait. The girl says no, that it's fine. In the meeting, Cheolmin tells the masters that there's an urgent task he's assigning to both guilds regarding an unconfirmed portal that appeared 3 days ago, but this portal appeared and disappeared in the suburbs. Taehyun asks if this was a problematic dungeon. The president replies that it hadn't been confirmed yet, since it was impossible to even measure the portal's mana. This surprises even Yi-hyuk, as well as the swordsman, who begins to find it very strange that a portal couldn't even be measured. Normally, the rank of a portal is determined by 2 factors. First, using a special measuring instrument to measure the portal's mana, because the final rank of the portal usually correlates with the rank of the monsters inside it. And second, by combining the reports from the scouts sent by the association. The president says that for problematic dungeons, the mana of the portal typically increases rapidly, but this situation was different because the mana hadn't been measured yet. Taehyun asks Cheolmin if he had tried sending scouts. The president replies that he had already sent 5, but none had returned. Yi-hyuk tells Cheolmin that he didn't know the rank of the portal, had no information, and hadn't informed anyone immediately. To him, it seemed like an attempt to shift the blame. The president responds that, even so, the association doesn't know how long the unknown ranked portal's curtain will remain. So, in this situation, if they let it slide, it wouldn't be surprising if monsters eventually escaped, as there had been similar cases before, and every time, it was a hell to resolve. And even though it's embarrassing, this was an emergency, and he wasn't going to accept a no. That's why he wanted both the Overkill and Shinhwa guilds to work together to deal with the unconfirmed portal. Cheolmin explains that, initially, he wanted to send the Hyunmu guild as well, but because they were suddenly sent overseas, they wouldn't be able to join this mission. However, this was serious enough to involve the 3 largest guilds. The president made it clear that the deadline was 2 days, and that they would provide both a support amount and a reward at the highest rates. But it was clear that if the masters needed anything else, the association would help in any way possible. Taehyun thinks for a moment and asks whether the groups need to be made up only of guild members. Cheolmin says it doesn't matter, but since the portal's existence could cause chaos and panic among the public, he would authorize a small number of people whose identities were verified. Yi-hyuk didn't understand why Taehyun had asked that question, and now, knowing the answer, he wanted to hear Taehyun's response. The swordsman, already with a plan in mind, tells the president that he understood enough. After the meeting at the Shinhwa Guild building, Yi-hyuk arrives, scaring everyone in the building. He takes off his coat and tells his assistant to form a group using only guild members, with ranks A and above. The chosen members must be available to leave within 2 days. The talkative Yi-hyuk was thinking about the smile Taehyun had given, as it seemed like he had a card up his sleeve. But, regardless, The purple-haired man wanted to use this opportunity to crush his rival. He instructs his assistants to include Yuran in the group. Yunya tells her boss that Hunter isn't affiliated with any guild, and, with her personality, she definitely wouldn't accept. Yiyuk says he knows that, but orders them to bring her by any means necessary, and to place her in front of him. If they couldn't do that, they could prepare to never work again. The executor thinks this is the perfect plan to recruit Yuran, who wasn't part of any guild, and now he would show Taehyun, the association's president, that even among the major guilds, there were different ranks. 2 days later, the Overkill Guild was already ready in front of the portal. Jae-hee asks what time it is, since the Shinhwa Guild hasn't arrived yet. Jun says there are still 5 minutes left, and that they were always like this, showing up at the last minute. The gunslinger grabs her weapon and says that's why she didn't like the Shinhwa Guild, because not only were they arrogant, but they were also rude, and that's why she wanted to teach them some manners by shooting them in the head. Jun punches the girl in the head, and tells her he already warned her to watch what she says. With a bump on her head, Jae-hee tells her companion that he was brutally strong. Hearing this, Jun steps forward and asks who's brutal, then starts running toward her to give her a lesson. Watching this, Shin tells the master that the members of the Overkill Guild get along well overall. Taehyun responds that, even though they're fighting, they're reliable during battle, and thanks the weapons maker for agreeing to be there, as he had believed he would refuse. Shin says he used the item he received, and that was part of the reason he agreed, out of honor. As they waited for the other guild to arrive, Jun and Jae-hee kept fighting. The protagonist recalls when he first received this hidden mission about a historical dungeon that had opened, where they had to create an ending for the open portal in order to receive unknown rewards. This system window had appeared 5 days ago for Shin, who was surprised to see it was a mission that only a small number of players would receive. He didn't understand why the selection process hadn't even started, yet he was already being given a hidden mission, but there was no reason to refuse. Despite these missions being extremely difficult, completing them would result in incredible rewards, and some players even awakened new abilities. But even before meeting with the members of Overkill, he didn't think it could be a mysterious dungeon. Taehyun tells Shin that he'll apologize for the rudeness Yiyuk would be showing from that point on. Jun and Jae-hee immediately stop fighting upon hearing the voice of the loudmouth, who had just arrived. Yiyuk walks in saying he had a lot of work to do, which is why he was late, unlike Overkill, who apparently had too much time on their hands, with all their members just wandering through low-ranked portals. Jun grabs the gunslinger and tells her not to pay attention. Seeing that the girl wasn't going to listen, the warrior covers her mouth and warns her again to ignore what she hears. Shin realizes that the poor relationship between the guilds hasn't changed. This wasn't just an emotional fight between the guilds, but a topic that all the media outlets were debating. Which guild was the strongest? Yiyuk, seeing the weapons maker, underestimates him and starts laughing, asking Taehyun if this was his trump card. During the meeting, Taehyun had acted as though he had something surprising up his sleeve, but it seemed like it was nothing at all. The loudmouth said this based on Shin's clothes and the appearance of being a weak player. Yiyuk was already getting irritated just by seeing the protagonist and tells Taehyun that he was going too far, because dealing with a dungeon wasn't a joke, especially when it seemed like he wanted to be carried through it. Yoonji tells her master to calm down, as they also had a new member. Yuran approaches and tells the purple-haired man that she didn't have time to waste, as she wasn't interested in having a discussion. Jae-hee, seeing the woman, is horrified and wonders what kind of group formation this was, because Yuran was the strongest elemental master in Korea, capable of using all 6 elements, in addition to Yiyuk, a rank 5 sorcerer. The gunslinger also recognizes Taehyun as a star, thinking that the dungeon would be a piece of cake, and that she would be proudly carried through it. As they walk toward the portal, Shin thinks that this mission won't be easy at all, since this was the same dungeon that had failed to be completed in his past life. Of the 8 members in the group the last time, only Taehyun had survived, and barely, since he had used his invasion skill. After that, the portal suddenly disappeared and remained an unprecedented case, where 7 high-rank awakeners were declared missing, including Yiyuk, who was one of them. But now, because the association had made great efforts to censor everything, no information about that dungeon existed, so the protagonist thought it would be difficult for them to finish it this time. Once they pass through the portal, they encounter a demonic doll, but the sorcerer easily defeats it. This makes Shin start to wonder why things were going so easily. The group enters a room that resembles a mansion, but without warning, the door where the portal came from closes by itself. Jun tries to open it, but fails, then says they'll have to break it open. Jae-hee joins the warrior and Chan to try and force the door open, but when they strike it, it doesn't even budge. Yiyuk tells everyone to step aside, as he would try to do something. However, before he can act, he notices several demonic dolls approaching. He turns around and begins attacking them, wondering where these dolls were coming from. After the loudmouth manages to defeat the creatures, Yoonji asks her master why he didn't use his skill. The sorcerer replies that it was unnecessary to use his abilities on them, but the girl notices that the creatures were reviving themselves. Realizing the dolls had a resurrection ability, Yi-hyuk decides to use his skill, creating 2 magical fists and attacking all of them at once. Jun and Jae-hee also begin attacking the creatures, which are difficult to defeat. Chan starts helping the group, attacking with his spear. Meanwhile, Yoran is standing at the back of the room, alongside Shin, who asks her if she wasn't going to fight. The elemental master wants to know if he wasn't going to fight either. The protagonist says he's just a support role. Yoran replies that those creatures weren't a big deal, and that she didn't want to put in any effort for this group. Watching Taehyun fight, she says she's a little excited, because she'd heard that the strongest in Korea would be in the dungeon, but it seemed like they were just proud, since they hadn't managed to kill a single doll yet. Yoran tells Shin that if she knew it would be like this, she wouldn't even be there. The protagonist starts analyzing the creatures and finds something strange, noticing that the corrupted mana emanating from them wasn't normal. Then he realizes they were being controlled by strings, and when he looks up, he sees that all the mana the dolls were using was coming from the same source. Realizing this, Shin figures that if he could just destroy the object distributing the mana, the dolls would be defeated, but he didn't want to reveal his skill just yet. Still, if necessary, he could use his paid rental ability. Before the protagonist could do anything, he notices that Yurin is creating several crystals, so he asks her why she wasn't helping, if she had mana to deal with the bugs. The woman replies that she hadn't explained before that she only kills what she wants to, and then uses her magic to kill a fly. Seeing this, Shin thinks he should learn more about the elemental master. He asks her if she was afraid of insects. Yurin responds that she's not, and that he didn't need to speak to her anymore. The protagonist apologizes and says he doesn't want to intrude, then points upward, telling her there's a monster insect. In reality, Shin had created a shield in the shape of a spider in front of the object that was distributing mana to the dolls. Seeing the giant spider, Yurin uses her skill and fires a huge fireball to attack it. The protagonist removes his creation from the way so the attack could hit the object directly, destroying the mana distribution strings and defeating the dolls. While still fighting the puppets, Yi-hyuk wonders why the elemental master had used her skill when it wasn't necessary. But to his surprise, he notices that the dolls have stopped moving. He picks one up and realizes that, indeed, they were now lifeless. The loudmouth says that now he's warmed up and will defeat them all easily. Meanwhile, Shin approaches the object Yuran destroyed and begins absorbing the corrupted mana. As he does this, he reflects that if he hadn't been able to see the mana chains, he never would have figured out how to defeat those creatures. Seeing how difficult the fight was for the rest of the group, he thinks that this is the reason everyone had failed in his past life. Taehan walks up to Jun and says that the lobby is practically done, but since they weren't sure, they should check the entire first floor. The warrior follows his master's orders, saying he will go ahead and that everyone should follow him. It doesn't take long for them to find more puppets. Immediately, Yi-hyuk runs ahead, telling everyone to get out of his way, as he will be the first to attack the creatures. He starts striking them right away. Since Shin knows that attacking directly won't defeat these monsters but doesn't want to speak up, he moves closer to the mana distribution point for the dolls and asks Jae-hee if she can shoot where he's pointing. The girl says yes and does as he asks, successfully destroying the distribution object and easily defeating the dolls. After that, the group starts to advance, although they still don't understand how all the creatures were dying at once. Shin, however, is still behind because he's absorbing the corrupted mana. In this way, they move through the next room in the same fashion, and the first floor is conquered easily. Taehyun is at the front of the group and says that now they should head to the second floor. The sorcerer tells the swordsman that he already knew that, so he didn't need to keep acting like the leader. Taehyun ignores the loudmouth and tells Jae-hee and Jun to follow him. The gunslinger, fiddling with her weapon, is eager to teach the sorcerer a lesson, but her partner does everything he can to avoid it. Yi-hyuk, seeing the swordsman's reaction, gets frustrated and thinks he'll crush that pride within the dungeon. But for the moment, he decides to follow Taehyun after noticing Yoonji had approached. The sorcerer feels a pain in his arm and admits he had already exerted himself too much fighting the dolls, so he needed to stay calm. Meanwhile, Shin was still on the lower floor, watching everything unfold. After seeing Yi-hyuk head up the stairs with Yoonji, he admits that something was bothering him. Even though Taehyun had said there was nothing left, Shin decides to check a room next to the stairs for himself. Upon entering the room, he quickly notices several chains and corrupted mana on the floor. This only deepens his curiosity about what could be going on. Meanwhile, on the second floor, the group is engaged in an even tougher battle. The sorcerer, defending attacks, says that he hasn't had time to use his skill, but that's no different for Taehan and his group, as they too can only defend. They were being attacked from all sides, but despite the difficulties, the swordsman asks if everyone's okay, as they were fighting a high-ranked invisible monster. June says he's fine. Jae-hee replies that she's also fine, but she hasn't been able to see the support who was supposed to be with them. Taehan is surprised, as only now does he realize that Jin isn't there, especially now that the battle is getting harder. Shin is still downstairs, absorbing the corrupted mana from the area. After finishing, he decides it's time to join the group. But as he's about to leave the room, a door opens, revealing a staircase. Seeing something approaching, he thinks it could be an enemy, but then notices it's actually a child holding a doll. This makes him wonder what she could be doing there. The girl, upon seeing Shin, asks if he's a hunter and runs off, asking him to follow her. The protagonist tells her to wait a moment and asks how she knew he was a hunter. The little girl says that Uni, who was downstairs, had told her a hunter would come to save her, and that they would leave together once that happened. Since he had reached that point, he must be the hunter who was going to save Uni. Curious about who this could be, Shin follows the girl downstairs. As they descend, the girl finds it strange that this hunter doesn't know Uni, as she's sure he's the one who was supposed to save them. When they reach the room, the woman is sitting, and the girl asks her to stand up, saying there's someone there. Shin notices that Uni is mentally injured, so he tells her he's been sent by the Hunter Association. Upon hearing this, the woman immediately stands up and asks if he's really been sent to rescue her. The protagonist confirms it, and though he's in a hurry, he wants to know what happened. Uni kneels, thanking him, relieved to be out of the situation. Though weakened, she begins to recount what happened. Uni had been part of the 4th escort sent to that portal. Since the first 3 teams hadn't returned, she was ordered to search for the missing ones. However, as soon as she entered, the dolls began appearing from all corners. Caught off guard, she tried to return the way she came, but for some reason, the door was locked and wouldn't open. Shin recalls that it was the same situation they had faced, so he asks if she knew what happened to the other scouts who were missing. Uni says she does, and that she called out to them at the entrance, but something was off, like they weren't conscious. Moreover, they suddenly began attacking her, so she fled and ended up finding the little girl, who helped her a lot. The girl says that Uni played a lot while she was with her. Shin asks the child what her name is. The girl replies that her name is Elizabeth, but she can call her Beth. The protagonist tells the child that they should leave the area now, as it's too dangerous for her to be alone. Beth asks why it's dangerous there when outside is even more dangerous. Meanwhile, on the upper floor, the battle continues. After a while, Taehan realizes that the opponent's stealth skill is slowly wearing off, and now he can tell it's a humanoid-type monster. Suddenly, in the middle of the fight, a card falls to the ground, and it's from the supposed monster. Jae-hee picks up the card and notices it's an ID from a scout named Cholsung, from the assassin hunter class. The man's face matches the document she had received from the missing scout. Immediately she tells the guildmaster that these were the missing scouts. Taehan and his group continue defending the attacks, as stealth is a skill that cannot be used for a few minutes after it has been used initially, and there's also the risk that movement speed will be reduced. The swordsman admits that they wouldn't be able to incapacitate the scouts easily, but it's just a matter of time. Yi-yuk is already preparing to use his skill, thinking it's some monster using stealth, and even after realizing they're scouts, he doesn't back down when their speed decreases. He charges forward to kill them all in the time of a single breath. Just as he's about to strike, a bullet fired by Jae-hee grazes the sorcerer's nose, causing him to stop and, enraged, ask what's going on. The gunslinger asks Yi-yuk if he's gone mad, because those people aren't monsters. They're the scouts they need to save. Moreover, there's a way to bring them back to normal. The talkative one asks why save them, as once he feels the murderous intent, there are only 2 choices: kill or be killed. And it doesn't matter who it is, anyone who shows murderous intent against him should die, and that includes whoever shot at him. But before he can do anything, the scouts resume attacking, heading straight for Yi-hyuk, who doesn't even attempt to defend himself, still furious, and repeatedly saying that if anyone stops him again, they'll be the first to die. Jae-hee calls him an idiot for doing this. Taehan intervenes and tells the sorcerer to listen to him. Yi-hyuk tells the swordsman that they must be blind for some reason, but he'll show them just how blind they are. In the middle of the fight, Taehyun says he'll make a deal. He'll give all the proceeds from the invasion and the funds he'd received to the Shinhwa Guild. With those terms, he believes the sorcerer might at least consider it. Helping his group once more, Yi-hyuk says this deal will only be for a limited time, and if he gets annoyed again, he'll kill whoever is in his way immediately. The swordsman thanks the sorcerer for agreeing, but thinks that, in reality, he's only bought a little more time. Jae-hee calls her master and apologizes for what she had done. Taehyun tells her to take responsibility for it later, and that, for now, they should focus on the battle, especially since they need to figure out how to save the scouts. Meanwhile, Beth asks Shin if he had seen those scary dolls when he first entered. She doesn't know exactly how, but all the dolls are attached to a purple string, and they won't die unless the strings are cut. Otherwise, they will keep attacking. Moreover, the strings are very resistant, so breaking them would be difficult. After explaining this, the girl tells the protagonist that it's really scary, but Shin only asks if the dolls can return to normal, because he wants the scouts to return to normal too. Beth says she's heard about this, and explains that in that case, the device attached to the doll's body must be stopped once the strings are cut. But if someone tries to cut the strings with force, the bodies will fall apart. Smiling, the girl asks Shin if she's helped. The protagonist was impressed by Beth, as even when asked a difficult question, she responded with a friendly and precise explanation. He then thought about asking her a few more things about this place. Back in the battle on the upper floor, Yi-hyuk was already frustrated with everything and declared that 20 seconds after the stealth skill ended, all those scouts would die because he couldn't take it anymore. Jae-hee began asking her master what they should do now, as the attacks were increasing. The gunslinger asked Yuran if she could help by blocking the attacks with ice or something. The elemental master began to help, but told Jae-hee to push beyond her limits, as the situation was getting irritating. Yi-hyuk continued his countdown, and while everyone else was still retreating and only defending, the sorcerer activated his skill with as much power as he could muster, preparing to attack the scouts when there was only 1 second left on the timer. But just as he was about to strike, he noticed that his skill was cancelled and felt the same pain he had experienced on the stairs returning. At that moment, Shin approached, telling Yi-hyuk that his skill had stopped at the perfect moment, as they nearly wouldn't have been able to save them all. The protagonist was with Beth and told Yi-hyuk that from now on, he could leave it to him. Taehyun asked the creator why he had disappeared earlier. Shin explained that he had to check something, but it wasn't a big deal. The swordsman said they were still in a dungeon, so he asked Shin not to act so independently. Jae-hee noticed that the scouts had used stealth again, so she warned her master to stay alert. Taehyun told Shin to stay behind him, but he realized that the scouts had passed by him without attacking, while the fight continued. The creator could see the scouts because of the mana lines surrounding them. The possessed individuals started attacking the swordsman, who was still defending. Shin warned that he would mark the scouts, since he could see their weak points, but asked Taehyun to strike precisely where he marked them, so their bodies wouldn't break apart. Taehyun understood, and immediately saw the blue marks identifying the bodies. He attacked the first scout nearby, and noticed that it worked perfectly, but hadn't thought about the fact that these people could be marked that way. Shin pointed out that the circular device in the middle was the weak point, so the attacks should be aimed there. Chan also managed to hit one of those devices, causing it to break. Yi-hyuk didn't understand why this was happening because before, nothing had happened when he attacked. But it didn't take long for Shin to mark all of them, so they could free the scouts. After the battle, the sorcerer was calmer, while Chan helped his companion. Taehyun asked the weapon creator what he had found when he returned to the first floor. The protagonist said it wasn't anything special. He was investigating the dungeon alone and had found a surviving scout, but she wasn't doing well, so she wasn't with him. Additionally, he had discovered a few things, including the weak point of the scouts. The master asked Shin how he had found that child. The protagonist replied that the girl had helped him find Uni, and it seemed like her parents had also gotten trapped in the portal. Yi-hyuk began looking at Beth more closely and said she was very suspicious. Jae-hee, being just a child, asked the sorcerer what was suspicious. Yi-hyuk explained what was wrong with what he had said, since, logically speaking, how could there be a normal child in this place? This was a secret and protected portal. Although there could have been a slip-up, the association had never taken their eyes off the portal, so there was no way anyone could have gotten in. Taehyun tells Yi-hyuk that he understands his logic, but it's not good to jump to conclusions too quickly. The sorcerer gets irritated with the swordsman, saying that he's obsessed with finding flaws in everything he says. Furthermore, he continued to mess everything up, and Yi-hyuk wasn't sure why he was holding back. He could just take this opportunity to kill every single member of the guild. Hearing this, Taehyun says that he didn't enjoy pointless fights, but now it seemed necessary to teach him a lesson so that they could have a peaceful raid. Everyone was being affected by the corrupted mana, and Jae-hee began to speak, saying that the Shinhwa Guild deserved a lesson since they thought they were so tough. Yoonji responded that they didn't just think it, they were tough, and she asked the gunslinger why she wasn't helping Taehan, because if he died, they'd all be doomed. This argument continued to cause chaos between the members of the two guilds, pushing Taehyun and Yihyuk to the point where they were ready for combat. Shin, seeing all this, didn't understand what was happening and began to wonder why everyone's emotions were becoming so intense. But when he looked to the side, he saw Beth laughing, saying that all she did was stimulate everyone's emotions a little, and now they were fighting at this level. The girl began to thank her doll, which she called Appa, who started talking to Beth. He told her that he had easily used his brainwashing skill on those invaders because all he had to do was get close without raising suspicion. The protagonist admitted that when he first saw the girl, he was certain she was a monster. But now, he didn't understand when he started thinking of her as a normal child. After hearing the doll speak, he deduced that she had been brainwashed from the moment he first saw her. Shin hadn't been fully taken over yet, so he began acting to stop everything before they were all influenced to fight. But before he realized that the corrupted mana threads were not only tangled around him, but around everyone else as well, he understood that this was how everyone had been affected. He realized that Appa could use the mana threads not only to manipulate the body, but also the mind. Shin knew that he couldn't fall for the doll's lies, so he activated his passive skill, mana absorption, and thought to himself that Appa had chosen the wrong opponent. After activating his skill, the protagonist managed to absorb the mana threads from everyone. Beth started laughing and said to Shin that he knew how to absorb corrupted mana, and that it was fun. Seeing this, the protagonist realized that the child was a monster, and they all needed to attack her. But the girl stepped back and called for her mom and dad. 2 adult dolls dropped from the ceiling, and after landing on the floor, Beth told her parents that the people had been bullying her and therefore deserved to be punished. Yihyuk was already furious and charged at the dolls. Seeing this, Beth acted immediately and said that now it was time for her to show the show. After the sorcerer attacked Beth's father, he disappeared, leaving the loud-mouthed sorcerer completely confused. Taehyun, realizing that Yihyuk had acted too hastily, told him to be careful, but it was already too late. Yihyuk had been completely taken by the corrupted mana created by Oppa. Shin remembered that the mana he had felt from the sorcerer's hand when they were on the stairs was because of this. It turned out Yihyuk had been under Oppa's influence from the start. Beth laughed loudly, saying how amusing it was when allies became enemies, and asked Shin what he would do now that one of his comrades had turned into a doll. Taehyun began to act and said he would hold Yihyuk off for a while. He then asked his group to help him. Yoonji and Jae-hee immediately started helping the swordsman, but as they approached, something strange started happening. The gunslinger asked what was going on. Yoonji explained that this was the sorcerer's skill, which, when it sensed a life-threatening danger, made him impenetrable and unable to be interrupted for a period of time. But this could last for hours, and since Oppa didn't stop controlling Yihyuk, the group decided that, as they couldn't fight the sorcerer, they would focus on the other 3, Beth and her parents. As the group prepared for battle, Taehyun noticed that the energy the adult dolls were emitting made it clear they were different. They seemed to be on the same level as a high-level dungeon boss. The swordsman thought it would be dangerous to ignore those dolls and go straight for the girl, so it was better to face them head-on. However, something seemed off, and it could have just been his impression, but somehow Beth seemed different from the typical controller. Taehyun told Jun, Jae-hee, and everyone else to take care of the female doll, while he dealt with the male doll, and that they should use full force to finish the battle as quickly as possible. Everyone understood the orders and prepared for the fight. The male doll began charging at the group, and Taehyun activated his flame skill for combat. Meanwhile, Shin observed Oppa, who had the ability to turn opponents into dolls and control them. But the protagonist realized there had been a bug since the corrupted mana threads had been interrupted by Yihyuk's impenetrable chi. This was how Oppa turned hunters into dolls, but the more Shin thought about it, the stranger it seemed. He couldn't understand how the sorcerer's transformation had happened so instantly, especially after Shin had absorbed the corrupted mana from everyone using his mana absorption skill. Shin didn't understand why. Before using his absorption skill, when everyone was still tangled in the mana threads, Beth hadn't used the opportunity to turn everyone into dolls. But if, for some reason, she didn't do that, the protagonist speculated that she must have been just toying with them. While Jae-hee and Yoonji were attacking the female doll but unable to inflict any damage, Shin couldn't help but wonder why Beth hadn't revealed herself earlier. What had been her purpose in leading him to the Lost Scout and teaching them the weaknesses of those who turned into dolls? What was even more perplexing to Shin was why she had only shown her true nature after gaining his trust, making everything they'd learned seem pointless. No matter how much Shin thought about it, everything felt very strange, because these weren't the actions of someone who enjoyed causing internal conflict. It felt as though the girl was being forced to fight. Beth's father was engaged in a fierce battle against Taehyun, who after a while of fighting, realized that the dolls were incredibly resilient. However, with the weapon that Shin had made, he could channel his strength into it and maintain control. His explosion ability was too powerful for the doll to withstand. Although it was unfortunate, the Overkill Guild was prepared for complicated moments like this. Jae-hee also had her trump card, using a special weapon, even after June warned her that it was enough, since the doll no longer had any life. She used her enchanted cannonball-like bullet, making a huge hole in the chest of the puppet woman, finishing her off for good. Taehyun, also using his special ability, managed to cut the doll into several parts and set it on fire. The master admitted that things had become more complicated than he had imagined. But even after defeating these dolls, he was surprised that they had only used physical attacks. Despite being cautious, he knew he had to deal with Beth, who had strong mental attacks. But as a berserker, he believed he could withstand them somehow. The master instructed everyone to prepare and be wary of mental attacks. The girl called for her father and mother, who had been defeated. Taehyun ignored the girl and charged for an attack, while she remained still, laughing maniacally. Before the swordsman could decapitate her, her last words were that it was perfect. Seeing that scene, June was paralyzed. As for Jae-hee, it was something expected from the master, an easy victory. Yoonra was confused, as the girl had acted as if she were all-powerful, but in the end, she was just annoying. Shin thought it would be better if things ended that way, and that his assumptions had been wrong, but he noticed something strange happening with the girl's body. Taehyun admitted that, even though he was a monster, seeing a child's body in that state wasn't a pleasant sight. When he thought everything was over, he turned and told everyone to fall back. But after that, the four hunters froze, not because of magic or mental attacks, but because this dungeon had something they had never experienced or faced before. With an overwhelming presence, the girl's body began to regenerate. Seeing this, Shin said that he had expected something strange to happen. The hidden boss was revealed, the ancient vampire Elizabeth Bathory. A message appeared, stating that the new main objective was to defeat Elizabeth Bathory, with the reward being the demon chains of control. The additional objective was unknown, as well as the reward. After appearing, the vampire thanked them for doing this, as she had been waiting for someone to kill her father and mother for a long time. Elizabeth said that her parents had betrayed her, managing to live forever with her power, being ungrateful rats who had trapped her in that useless body. But now, she finally felt alive, not even knowing how much time had passed, hating everything until she died. Yoonra, already preparing for battle, asked the gunwoman and June not to stand still like statues and to prepare as well. Even though Taehyun was talented, he couldn't fight a monster of that size alone. Seeing that no one had attacked yet, Elizabeth told the hunters they were being cute, but they were nothing but rats. Once again, everyone froze under her overwhelming energy. The vampire began using her essence drain ability to enjoy her first meal in a long time. Everyone was hit and began to have their blood drained from various parts of their bodies. Yoonra, feeling this, thought it was absurd, as she knew that high-level undead were skilled with absorption-type magic. But at that distance, and with that many people, she couldn't understand how the vampire was managing to suppress them all without any preparation or conditions. Even though he was hit by the ability, Taehyun became enraged and used his fire skill to counterattack, channeling his strength into his sword. He struck at the vampire, but she stopped the sword with only one hand, leaving the swordsman stunned. Elizabeth told the master that he really was strong, and even in his current state, he could still pose a threat to her. And if he used all his power, the result might be different. Breaking the sword with a single hand, she declared that this wouldn't happen. The vampire then landed a powerful punch on Taehyun, sending him flying. The master, shocked by everything happening and still injured, felt the blow he received and was left speechless when Shin asked him how much he thought he had left in terms of strength. The protagonist explained that he was talking about the power of the berserker's explosions, because he knew that the body and rationality couldn't endure if he used 100% of his power all the time. Shin had heard that Taehyun adjusted the power depending on the situation, and since this fight was getting tough, the power probably had to be higher. But as he was still a novice when it came to the explosion skill, he wasn't entirely sure. The protagonist told the master that when he killed the Arachne, the power he used was less than half of his maximum, and after that, he used even less. The master said that, even if that were the case, the strongest sword ever made had broken. Moreover, in his current state, he wasn't sure if he could use a power he had never used before, but he might be able to buy some time if he made another weapon. Shin said that now he wanted to monopolize his abilities, and even though he found it ridiculous, he felt that from this moment on, he would remain tied to Taehan. The master realized that the weapon maker was using corrupted mana to craft the weapon and was surprised to see that. While finishing the weapon, the protagonist remarked that it was important now for each of them to show how much they had evolved. Shin used his new skill, demon weapon creation. He used 100% of his accumulated corrupted mana and began searching for a suitable weapon in the demon realm. Elizabeth was preparing for another attack, but before she could act, the weapon was complete. It was the Leviathan demon sword. Shin told Taehan to take the sword, and that now it was his turn to show the true power of his ability. The swordsman was impressed with the weapon, and admitted that it was different. The mana he felt was truly distinct. He acknowledged that he would grab it immediately if it were a sword that granted several special abilities, but he felt something else, even though it was a weapon made by Shin. Despite not being completely sure, Taehan took the sword, emanating a massive amount of power, which everyone could feel. The vampire could sense the energy coming from the sword created with corrupted mana. She admitted that with the energy she felt, it must be a special fire attribute ability, and it was quite powerful. She told Shin that she was surprised by the weapon he had created with corrupted mana and flames, noting that it had a pretty good energy. But now, unfortunately, he was going to die. The vampire used her blood magic skill and created a bloody territory, hitting the protagonist even though he was far away. Shin was surprised by this area skill, especially with its silent absorption. And even though this absorption wasn't like the previous one, it was still a very versatile skill. The hunters had also fallen into this skill, where the manipulation of mana and the basic functions of metabolism were slowly paralyzed, melting the body from the bones to the muscles, nerves, and veins. Over time, the pain wasn't as intense. Taehan, still standing and seeing all of this, walked toward the vampire, holding his sword, intending to finish it once and for all. Elizabeth was surprised to see that the swordsman was fine, even after she activated her bloody territory. But it didn't take long for her to realize that he wasn't perfectly fine, and that, in fact, he was moving with the ability of the sword. And even with the power he had now, he seemed stronger. The vampire, even knowing she was facing a strong opponent, says it will be fun because she was tired of only destroying dolls. Taehan begins running toward Elizabeth and uses his blood magic again. With thirsty hands, he creates 2 demonic hands, attacking directly at the master who was approaching. The swordsman uses the power of his sword and easily cuts through the demonic hand. The vampire is impressed by this, but doesn't stop attacking, using her other created hand to strike. She admits that now, Taehan has double the strength compared to before, or maybe even more. Even from a distance, the master uses his skill, Explosion, which even surprises Shin with its power. The swordsman delivers his strike, cutting not only the demonic hand, but also landing a hit to Elizabeth's chest. The protagonist now realizes that Taehan had been supplementing his power for a long time, deducing that even he didn't know about it. A message appears saying the main objective has been completed, and the hidden boss, the ancient vampire Elizabeth Bathory, has been defeated. Shin receives a reward in the form of an item, and before opening it, hopes it is something related to mana recovery. The protagonist also dispels the materialization of Leviathan, and next time he uses it, this skill won't need to search for the weapon separately. He will be able to simply materialize it. Seeing this message, Shin now knows that the weapon's retrieval condition, when it was being created, is completely random. Taehan doesn't understand how the sword disappeared from his hand until the protagonist tells him that if he had been okay, he could have left the sword behind. But since he was so injured and had used a new level of power, it was impressive that he was still conscious. Shin then asks him to rest a bit, as it seemed like no one else's life was at risk. Shin approaches the vampire's body, and upon seeing him approach, she congratulates him on his achievement. The protagonist is stunned, as she had suffered a fatal wound but was still alive, even though it had appeared that the raid had been successful. Shin asks Elizabeth what her connection to that dungeon was, as he could feel that the same corrupted mana flowing from her was the same as the one controlling the dolls. Even though she had no control over them, they still continued to protect her. The vampire replies that it was clear they had to protect her because they were the precious source of power that helped keep them alive. Elizabeth explains that long ago, she had given herself to her then-parents on a whim. After defeating a creature to protect them, she did something she normally wouldn't have done, saved their lives, which were on the verge of drowning. But if that were all, it would just be a strange story. A woman approached her to thank her, and it was then that she realized they were just strange rats. The woman had said that she could let their savior go and insisted that she accept the invitation to go to the house where they lived. Elizabeth says that was the first time she had heard such a thing from a human. Then, after going to the house where those people lived, the woman showed her a crystal ball, while the man showed her the giant dolls he had built himself. The vampire admits that she didn't know when things started to change, and only realized that she was no longer a guest, but part of the family. And even though it was for a short time, she had been happy watching the child play with the dolls as puppets, until she realized that the real reason those people had accepted her as family was to manipulate her like a puppet. But Elizabeth says that the fault was hers. By giving them the chance to betray her and then control her, it was proof that she had become soft and weak. And it was also the way they managed to trap her in the body of a child, sealing many of her abilities, making her only supply the corrupted mana needed to protect them. Shin, curious, asks what they needed protection from. The vampire says she isn't sure either, and asks the protagonist if he has looked outside since entering there. Before Shin can answer, she says it's a fantastic scene, an endless, vast desert, and no matter where you go, it never ends. That wasn't a natural desert, but rather a barrier, a space created to protect that place. Elizabeth says she is sure her mother used her power to create it, to protect herself from the monsters that came out of the fissure. Shin is impressed by this story. The vampire notices his reaction and then asks if the world he comes from was also affected by the fissure. Before the protagonist can answer, she says she believes it was, and that's why he's here. For Elizabeth, the two worlds were affected by the same things. A fissure appeared in the sky, awakened humans with mana emerged, and more portals began to appear. Shin asks what emerged from the portals in her world. The vampire says they were monsters far crueler than she was. Knowing this, the protagonist asks Elizabeth how, in their world, they dealt with these portal calamities and how many years had passed since the first fissure opened. The vampire says that, unfortunately, she didn't get to see it for herself, as after being trapped in that body, she spent a dark period where she couldn't move. It was during this time that her world fell apart, and that place became isolated. Elizabeth says she only regained the ability to move recently, after receiving a message telling her it was an hidden dungeon mission, where she had to drive away intruders from various worlds. The mission's goal was to repel a total of 100 intruders, with the reward being her freedom from that isolated world. Shin is stunned to learn that the vampire also received a system window, meaning she too was a player. Elizabeth tells the protagonist that it seems like he has many questions, but she apologizes, saying she won't be able to answer them all, as she is about to die. As she is dying, the vampire says that death isn't as bad as it seems. Shin becomes desperate as he sees Elizabeth's body starting to disintegrate. Immediately, he takes the item he received as a reward, the demon chains of control. He opens the box, glad to have received such a necessary item at that moment, and before the vampire dies for good, he places the chain around her neck. This was a forced imprisonment item, which could be used on defeated monsters or those in a critical state. Shin says it wasn't a coincidence, and while he could have kept it for later use, he was personally interested in knowing more. A monster equipped with the chain would be healed from its critical state and would become a subordinate, like a familiar, to the player who equipped the item. The protagonist admits he had seen many players with familiars, but never something like this, because now he had a player as a familiar. Now the ancient vampire was under control, and a contract would be formed. Afterward, Elizabeth was registered as Shin's familiar, and he was surprised to see she had transformed into a different form, something unexpected. The vampire had turned into a cat instead of a bat. Even the collar had changed to fit her neck. Elizabeth was upset at having turned into an animal, but quickly returned to her vampire form, saying it was a joke that she had become a familiar. She tries to forcibly remove the collar, but can't. Seeing she has no other choice, she says that instead of enduring this humiliation, she would have preferred to die. Shin says it's unfortunate, but she must accept it, as she doesn't even have the option to refuse this humiliation. A message appears stating that if corrupted mana or mana is provided, the familiar's abilities can be unlocked. The protagonist still doesn't know how he will use Elizabeth, as now she is a familiar who can't even use transformation. Despite this, the vampire approaches the protagonist and says that she is now under his care. He picks her up in her cat form and lifts her, causing her to become furious and demand that he let her go. Shin is surprised to see that his familiar can speak in this form, though he isn't sure if that's a good thing. The protagonist tells Elizabeth that he's going to ask something unrelated to what they've been talking about, but he wants to know if she was truly betrayed by those people. The vampire, irritated, says she's already said everything and that she's not lying. Shin puts her down and says that, since she doesn't need to repeat everything, he has one question because, while listening to her, some things didn't quite add up. He didn't understand when Elizabeth said that those people stole her power to survive, because living as dolls didn't make sense. The protagonist says that he doesn't know exactly what happened, but her family didn't seem that refined. Moreover, it seemed like they had no rationality or ego. Instead of living beings, they seem more like dolls with their movements predetermined. Elizabeth, furious, says there's nothing strange about it, and that human mentality is made to change and fit the physical body, and that her family ended up like that because they used the force of corrupted mana, so it was clear that their rationality and ego would disappear. The vampire asks her master if he wants her to feel empathy for those people. Shin says not exactly, and that he's just saying that, if it were him or other humans, they wouldn't have any choice but to continue living that way. The protagonist approaches the doll father and thinks that, if he swapped bodies, there must be some item that could do that. He starts thinking about what it could be. Elizabeth, seeing this, begins reflecting on what the protagonist said, about how they wouldn't have a choice but to live that way. It wasn't making any sense to her. Shin finds a crystal ball and orders his familiar to come to him. The vampire begins walking toward her master, despite the simple order. The protagonist shows her the item, which is called the essential crystal, typically used for dark magic and similar spells, and it contains a bit of one's own mana and soul. Shin suspects that Elizabeth's parents took this item and placed it in the dolls, bringing their souls into them. He deduces that, although they were weak, they were very skilled. The vampire is staring into the crystal and listening to what her master is saying when, suddenly, she starts remembering the past of her parents, as if she were inside it. Jihee, sitting with her husband and son, says that she had seen hundreds or even thousands of different visions in the past few days, but the results were always the same. The collision between two worlds in recent years was only going to increase until it became uncontrollable. The woman says that, even if they delayed it as much as they could, in 5 years, it would be too late to defend against the monsters. Elizabeth, inside that memory, begins to recognize that this wasn't happening in the present, and that it must be a vision based on her father's memories. Juan asks his wife about a secret method, because if the theory of a different dimension that she was researching worked, at least their family could survive. Jihee, sadly, says that if they had Beth's help, they could at least separate the land around their house. But the problem would be later, because if the world they lived in collapsed, that house would be adrift in the space between two dimensions, until someone from another world found it, which could take hundreds, thousands of years, or even more. And in truth, they would only be waiting for a slow death. One considers it a catastrophe, as they had no way out. But their son Yong says that Beth couldn't die. His mother is startled and asks what he means by that. The boy says that, since they could only live a few more years. Crying, the boy says that Elizabeth was different from them, and then asks if they couldn't save her. He explains that the reason they were alive was because she saved them from the monster. Even though his parents were shocked by his thinking, the boy knew it was something they couldn't ignore, because he believed that at least one person from the family should survive. Even knowing that Beth wouldn't cooperate, they deceitfully placed mana strands on her so that she wouldn't revolt. The vampire, even seeing that her family was sad, thought that they had betrayed her by imprisoning her in the body of a child. After doing this, they used the crystal to transfer their bodies into the dolls, leaving their consciousness intact. One says this would only last for a period, some years, or even hundreds of years, but he wasn't sure how long the consciousness would remain. But after that, it would slowly fade, and after 200 years, they would probably forget who they were. But their son says that even so, they would still be dolls, and needed to do this, even if that dimension was isolated. They didn't know what dangers or things might appear, and this time, they would protect Beth from all dangers. Even though they didn't know how long it would last, they were willing to do it until someone from another world saved her. Shin saw all that memory, and then decided to give 50 corrupted mana to his familiar, unlocking her abilities for a short time. Elizabeth returned to her vampire form, and crying, wondered why her family hadn't told her about all of this. The protagonist tells Beth that if they did this, they would all die together, and that this was a problem they couldn't avoid, that she would choose to die with them. Shin decides to leave her alone with her family, and tells her to get up, because there wasn't much time. Elizabeth had a time limit to have her abilities unlocked. The protagonist tells the vampire that this wasn't a full recovery, and that he had only transferred 50 mana, which gave her just 3 minutes with her abilities. He wasn't going to waste his mana for her to keep crying, since it was her duty to finish everything, because they were the family who stayed all that time as dolls just to protect her. To Shin, now, in the end, Elizabeth should help her family rest. The vampire is desperate, and says that she can't do something like that. The protagonist turns to her and tells her not to be so pathetic, because even though her family knew they would die, they could only organize themselves to live their last moments happily. But that's not what happened. Since they chose of their own will to live in eternal imprisonment, just for her future, which they weren't even sure they'd reach. Shin tells Beth that this wasn't for her, but rather a chance to show devotion to them, the least she could do. After hearing that, the vampire stands up, still crying, and looks at her family, who were now all dolls, remembering how they were happy in the past. Elizabeth uses her power to rebuild them, in order to give them a dignified end. After that, a message appears saying that the additional objective was completed, discovering Elizabeth's life, and the reward was the box of cursed treasure. Even though she was sad, the vampire now knew everything and recognized that she had done the right thing. Now, the narrative dungeon was 100% complete, and the additional rewards would be given. The group started to leave the portal, where several paramedics were already waiting for them. Taihan was helping Jae-hee walk to a place where she could be treated. A doctor was helping Jun, who was also severely injured. Yi-yuk had to be carried out since he was very weakened. Watching all of this happen, Shin tells Beth that he felt like this mission took longer than he expected, even though he knew he shouldn't be saying that in front of her. The protagonist asks his familiar what she thought of this world. The vampire says that it couldn't compare, since the mana she could feel was weak. But since she didn't have the right to choose, no matter where she went, she had to do her best and live. After some time, Yunran was at home, unable to sleep after a tense day. When she entered the kitchen, she noticed there was someone there and asked why there was a rat in her house. Suddenly, the light turned on, and Dong-hae spoke, saying he wasn't a rat, and he had just been waiting for his colleague, even grabbing a glass of wine because she was taking too long. Yunran began to use her powers and asked the executor to explain why he was there, asking if he wanted to pay for the wine he was drinking because even his life wouldn't be enough for that. Dong-hae told the elemental master that she was cruel, but it was obvious he wasn't there for personal reasons. He just wanted to know what had happened with the unconfirmed dungeon she had participated in. As she knew, the person they served was very interested in unconfirmed dungeons, so he wanted to know how fun it had been. Yunran recounted the part where she passed out. After hearing the story, the executor said he was surprised she hadn't seen everything, even though he didn't expect that from an untouchable queen. The priestess told him to be quiet since it happened because things had gotten a bit chaotic. Even though she passed out, she managed to confirm the results with her own eyes, seeing Taehan finish off the boss with 2 sword strikes, thanks to the support he had received. And even considering the power of berserkers, it was a level of power she had never seen before. Dong-hae slammed the table and, acting crazy, said that rank S people were really different, and now this swordsman deserved to be prey. Yunran told the executor not to rush because even though Taehyun had a strong presence, they should pay attention to his support. Dong-hae asked why, since he was just a rank D fish and all he did was use weapons. The priestess explained that the sword that was able to withstand Taehyun's full power was truly of great strength. The executor said that if they could get a resistant sword, it would be very useful, and he could even take such a weapon. But in the end, a tool was just a tool. If no one was holding it and using it, it would become useless. Dong-hae started heading for the door and said that the ability of those holding the sword was the purity of combat. Everything else was impure. Yunran told the executor that if he hunted Taehan, that impurity could be what caused him to lose him. Dong-hae didn't pay much attention to the priestess and said that she was just obsessed with a rank D support. And while he wasn't on the same level as Taehan, he was curious to see his strength. Before leaving, he said goodbye, telling her he would see her later, and by then, he should have already killed the swordsman and the impure support. A few days later, Shin was lying in his bed, having slept for several days in a row, but his condition still hadn't improved. He deduced that it wasn't due to the creation of the demonic weapon, but because of Beth's absorption skill. The protagonist started calling out to the vampire to ask a question about the skill she had used, wondering if there was a way to get rid of the side effects. But Shin received no answer and began to search for where she was. Seeing that the window was open, he guessed that she had gone out, curious to learn more about that world. He got up and knew that, since she was now his familiar, he could do a forced summoning, but as long as she didn't do anything strange, he wouldn't use it. Beth was on the street, exploring, when she was stopped by Hisu. Meanwhile, Shin went to the box of cursed treasure, still not believing he had managed to get it. But he knew that the box was a random reward, often given to players. Moreover, what came out of the box was random, not guaranteed 100%. The item the box granted was limited to something the owner of the box needed. However, the problem is that this function is like having one less screw, like giving a sharp and strong sword that can only be used for attacking and not for blocking, or a shield that can take any impact without recoil but directs the impact to a random person. Despite these extreme weaknesses, what makes this so perverse is that it's not an entirely useless item. as there have been many cases where people tried to use such equipment while meeting the conditions and ended up seeing blood. Shin admits that the item he needs right now is of only one type, something that increases his mana regeneration, or something that increases his maximum mana. The type of item that would come from the box was already determined, and the most important thing for the protagonist was to know what weakness the item would have. He opens the box of cursed treasure. The box then started selecting an item for player Shin. A bright light began to emerge from the protagonist's room until it faded, revealing the item Gula do Trader, Gluttony of the Trader, which allows the user to use the mana absorption skill. Shin was outraged at receiving this item, with the mana absorption function being proportional to the amount of favor the target had toward the user. The protagonist threw the ring at the wall and said that it was useless to him. Beth had returned and saw everything happening. Shin acknowledged that mana absorption wasn't a bad option, even calling it a powerful skill. But the favorability condition made him realize that the name of the item was strange. The vampire told her master that she didn't know why he was angry, but it seemed like he had a visitor outside, and it was the idiot who had come here before. The weapon maker went to the window to see who it could be. A limousine was parked in front of the building, and Yi-hyuk was stepping out of the car. The chatterbox didn't like that neighborhood at all and started asking why Tai-han was letting his support live in such a low-level place. Clearly his type, acting like a generous person but, deep down, being a damn ingrate. Seeing that, Shin admitted that the idiot had really arrived. The sorcerer, looking for where the weapon maker lived, recognized that, even though it seemed strange, he was there. Shin was valuable enough for that, because, even though he didn't have Yunran's report, Yi-hyuk could feel how the situation had gotten out of control. And, at that moment, Shin had done something for Taehyun, and the energy that the weapon emitted afterward was enough to break through the barrier and feel how much power it had. The sorcerer didn't know why Shin was ranked D, but he recognized that he definitely had the potential to become rank A or even higher. This meant that Taehyun hadn't hired him for nothing. But now, even though the weapon maker was on Taehyun's side, Yi-hyuk would do everything to change that. The protagonist went downstairs and approached the chatterbox, asking how he had found out where he lived, since no matter how he thought about it, there was no way he could have found his address legally. The sorcerer said it all depended on the point of view. As usually in such a situation, many people were surprised, thinking it could be a contract with the best guild, and since he was there to see him, he must have been very impressed. Shin apologized, and said that wasn't why he was there, and that today was the day of his renewal for his part-time employment assistant certificate. He then began to walk away, leaving Yi-hyuk alone. Seeing that the conversation wouldn't be easy, the chatterbox said he would pay 3 times the amount, and regardless of what Taehyun had promised, he would triple it. Even knowing that, because of what had happened in the dungeon, it seemed arrogant. Shin stopped to listen to what the sorcerer had to say. Now he was offering the best treatment that no other place could offer. The protagonist said he didn't know he was so self-aware, but his answer wouldn't change, and he would give the same answer he gave to Taehyun. There was nothing he could offer him. This left Yi-hyuk furious, since, in addition to Shin refusing his invitation, Yunran had done the same the day before. The priestess had told the sorcerer that he and the Shinhwa guild were a bunch of idiots. Now, seeing the protagonist turning his back on him, Yi-hyuk declared that he would just wait for the moment when Yunran and Shin would beg to join the guild. As the protagonist walked down the street, he thought that taking public transport to the Hunters Association was a pain, but since most hunters had cars, it made sense that he should have one too. At that moment, someone bumped into his shoulder, and he apologized. The person looked at him and shook their head. For a moment, Shin thought his injuries hadn't fully healed, but when he snapped back to reality, he realized that the person who had bumped into him was walking in a straight line when it happened. It could have been intentional, and besides, their face didn't seem unfamiliar. But the protagonist thought this couldn't be happening, and as he looked back, he spotted the person again. He deduced that this man might be Hyun, who was standing on the other side of the street, observing his old friend. After Shin went to the association, he headed straight for a portal that had opened, where a raid group was already waiting. Seok, the tank of the group, told them that if they were ready, they would enter, and warned them that from rank C portals onwards, even high-level hunters could get hurt or die due to carelessness. He reminded them all to be aware of that, but since lives were at stake, it didn't hurt to reinforce the point. Hana, who was standing next to Shin, said she was nervous, as it was her first time going into a rank C portal. The protagonist tried to calm her down, telling her that the tank was a veteran, and if they followed his orders, they shouldn't have many problems. But as he was just an assistant, that wasn't something he could guarantee. The girl told Shin that, even so, he seemed to be very experienced. Dojin was at the back of the group, watching the protagonist closely. He knew that the weapon maker was a rank D support with crafting abilities, and that he had been a hunter for 2 years, but with only 1 year of practical experience. The assassin recalled that at the beginning of the year, Shin had been part of the Dawan Guild, his brother Hyung's guild. Dojin remembered a conversation he had with his brother while they were eating, before Hyung entered a rank D portal. The girl had asked her older brother why he was trying to compare a simple rank D portal when, with the capabilities of their guild, they could buy rank C portals, or even bigger ones. Hyung explained that while the portal might be low rank, it was big and resource-rich, and in dungeons like that, the profits were enormous compared to the labor invested. That's why bigger guilds tried to grab them. Dojin said it sounded petty, since with all that money, they could buy something better, and rank D dungeons should only serve as small change for the big guilds. Hyung agreed with his brother, but said that this wasn't the case for smaller guilds, like his, especially when he could do a lot with half of the expected profit. The then leader of the Dawan Guild explained to his brother that with the profits, he could upgrade the equipment of the hardworking members of the guild, as well as train them in exclusive training facilities, rather than training with other guilds, and that it wouldn't be long before everyone recognized Dawan as a guild to be reckoned with. But that didn't happen. Dojin remembered when he received a call from the association and couldn't believe what he was hearing about his brother. He went to the association building to speak with the investigator handling the case. While they were talking, Dojin said it didn't make sense because his brother was rank B, and even the veteran hunters were recognized. Plus, there was no way he could have died in a dungeon like that. Hoon said that it wasn't a normal dungeon, and that Hyung had entered an unconfirmed portal. The post-investigation results showed that it was a place with an absurdly high degree of danger. This left Dojin stunned, and at that moment, he realized that his brother's death wasn't just an accident. He then remembered Hyung had said the portal was purchased through an official auction. Dojin didn't know if anyone else was involved, but he was certain that Hyung wasn't the type to lie like that. The investigator even asked the young man if Hyung had said anything before he left, but Dojin only thought there was something wrong with all of this, and that someone had managed to manipulate the auction. He told Hoon that his brother hadn't said anything before he left, but still felt something beyond the simple had occurred. After explaining what had happened, the investigator told Dojin that Hyung's body would be transferred in 2 days when the investigation was complete. He said he felt awkward saying it, but it had been sheer luck that they had found his body, and since there was a survivor, it was easy to collect the bodies. This intrigued Dojin, and he wanted to know who the survivor was, asking who they were. Hoon said he didn't know all the details, but it seemed the survivor had been lucky. Back at the portal entrance, Seok said they would now enter and finish the raid without any serious injuries, if possible. As Shin and Hana crossed the portal, Dojin was the last to go through, still observing all of the protagonists' movements, as he still didn't know how his rank B brother and all the veterans of the guild had died. How had a rank D assistant survived? Even if it was luck, it seemed strange. No matter how much he thought about it, Dojin wanted to know if Shin had anything to do with his brother's death, and no matter what he had to do, he would uncover the truth. After all the members of the group entered the portal, a security officer from the association, along with some military personnel, noticed a hunter approaching, intending to cross through the portal. The officer asked him to leave since he wasn't part of the raid. Dong-hae, laughing, approached the agent and claimed he was also part of the group but had arrived a little late. He handed over a document, his permission slip. While the agent read it, the enforcer muttered, questioning what kind of crazy person would show up fully prepared for a portal raid they weren't even part of. After verifying the permission, the officer confirmed Dong-hae's participation. Dong-hae celebrated his success, but the agent overheard him muttering something. The enforcer remarked that Dong-hae had said, "Good thing I managed to get the entry permit." However, as Dong-hae walked toward the portal, he murmured to himself that if he hadn't gotten permission, he would have killed the agent. His real objective, however, was someone else, his prey, Jin. Dong-hae intended to test the capabilities of this aspiring hero. Inside the dungeon, the group had already defeated several skeletal soldiers when they encountered the Headless Duke, a B-rank danger-level monster. After a fierce battle, Seok announced that they had finally defeated the creature. However, Dojin, standing near the tank, suspected something was off. This portal shouldn't have been ranked as C rank. Even with an identification error, it should have been, at most, a high-level B-rank portal. He admitted that if he'd concealed his abilities until the end, it could have been disastrous. Seok praised Dojin for his performance, noting that he didn't think anyone in the group was as talented. However, the dealer humbly replied that, although he contributed, he didn't do it alone. Others were injured and being healed by Hana, who also played an important role. Looking at his weapons, Dojin recalled the fight against the Duke. Seok's weapon had been broken during an attack, and with only inferior weapons available, he couldn't contribute much. Then, Shin approached, offering to craft a new pair of weapons if needed. Shin warned Seok to forget about these abilities until they were out of the dungeon. The dealer noted that these new weapons, crafted by the support, were not only powerful, but had cutting ability and weight several levels above his usual gear. This left him intrigued. Someone who could instantly materialize weapons of this quality couldn't possibly be a D-rank support. Dojin confronted Shin, asking who he really was. Shin turned and cryptically replied that Dojin should be asking himself that question. The dealer admitted he didn't know Shin's name and had never given his own, but then Dojin began removing his mask, stating he had a different question. He asked if Shin knew Hyung, his older brother, who was also the guildmaster of Dawon. As he removed his hood, Dojin revealed his identity. Shin was speechless upon learning this connection. Dojin, however, angrily said he didn't care who the weapon creator was. All he wanted to know was what happened on the day his brother died years ago. He warned that if Shin didn't talk, he'd take justice into his own hands. Before Shin could respond, a wave of attacks headed their way. Realizing the danger, Dojin defended against the powerful strikes, dragging himself to shield the group. The dealer was stunned, not expecting any monsters to still be alive. At that moment, Donghae appeared, impressed by how events were unfolding. The enforcer commented that even with the rising star Dojin, whose best days were still ahead, there weren't many who could fend off such an attack. Donghae then melted Baek and the rest of the group who had been separated from Shin and Dojin. Shin stood behind his shield, which he had created instantly to defend himself. Dojin, surprised by the stranger's abilities, admitted that he was incredibly strong. He began to wonder if Shin could be a berserker or something similar. Regardless, he was undoubtedly talented and exceptionally powerful. Donghae, observing his targets, told them not to be afraid and to calm down. After Shin dismissed his shield, Donghae mentioned hearing about a D-rank support in the attack group, but now realized Shin was an impure. Shin didn't understand what Donghae meant, but the executor stated that he needed Shin to make Taihan's hunt more entertaining, though he couldn't let him live. Dojin started questioning how Donghae knew Shin. The executor, as if tapping into his abilities, told Dojin that if he truly had something special, this hunt would be enjoyable. He then attacked Dojin directly, who defended himself while realizing his opponent had immense strength. Dojin noted he could reflect such attacks only once or twice more. If he took the damage from even a few of them, the fight would end quickly. He also noticed that Donghae left openings when attacking, so he decided to dodge all incoming strikes and wait for the right moment to counter. As Donghae attacked, he mocked that Shin seemed like a useless fool and that this couldn't even be considered a 2-versus-1 fight. Shin responded, saying Donghae was wrong. At that moment, the executor froze, entangled in threads of corrupted mana created by Beth, who had appeared in her vampire form. Together with Shin, she declared it was now 3 versus 1. A system message appeared for Shin, stating that no corrupted mana was available, and the penalty would be a drastic drain on his stamina and mana. Additionally, the familiar Elizabeth would be forcibly dismissed in 10 seconds. Shin had earned a brief summoning by risking death, but it was temporary. Even as the mana threads began to unravel, it bought enough time to turn the tide of the difficult battle. After being freed, Donghae struck at the vampire, but she used her mist skill, becoming translucent and evading the attack. She taunted Donghae, saying it was a pity that purely physical attacks were nothing to fear. Although he resembled Taeheon, their levels were slightly different, and it was evident that the swordsman's weapon played a role in this disparity. Laughing, Beth told Donghae it was goodbye. While he was distracted by her, Dojin approached from behind. When Donghae tried to attack Elizabeth again, the dealer seized the opportunity to strike. During this moment, Beth's summoning ended, and before disappearing, she remarked that the ending was a bit lazy. With one arm severed, Donghae remained standing in a combat stance. Dojin was also prepared, knowing his opponent was difficult to defeat, but he took solace in having inflicted a serious injury. Dojin told Donghae that if he wanted to stay alive, he should drop his weapon and surrender, though the outcome would likely remain the same given his sins. With few options left, Donghae dropped his weapon. This act seemed like a clear surrender, but Dojin immediately sensed ulterior motives. After dropping his sword, Donghae began channeling corrupted mana into his wound. Shin found it strange, but couldn't understand what Donghae intended. The executor was using the mana both to heal himself and to prepare for teleportation. He acted just as Dojin approached to deliver a potentially fatal blow, but when the dealer got close, Donghae disappeared. He then realized that the magic circle might have been a means of teleportation. Shin approached Dojin, saying he should feel relieved that it was only an escape item, as if it had been an attack or debuff item. Regardless of the outcome, they wouldn't have made it out unscathed. The dealer realized the weapon creator was different from the person he had imagined. Now, after the battle, Shin told Dojin that he would explain everything that had happened a year ago with the Dawan Guild and Hyung, because, as a brother, Dojin had the right to know. After some time, they exited the portal, where the bodies of the rest of the group were being retrieved. Shin and Dojin watched the scene, and Dojin said he felt uneasy seeing those people. Even though they were defeated by a psychopath, they had lied, claiming they were killed by monsters. Shin explained that they had no other choice because, according to security, they believed there were 7 people in the group. As someone with an access card entered the portal late after the group had gone in, Dojin said that didn't make sense. Shin agreed but explained that something unbelievable had happened. A forged pass good enough to fool security was used. However, it might not have been a fake pass. It could have been real. As Shin had mentioned earlier, it was the same type of pass Hyung had acquired a year ago when an unconfirmed dungeon was openly auctioned in a certified auction. Shin admitted he didn't know the objective of those responsible for such acts, but it was impossible for a small group to pull off something like that. If the association caught any of them, their organization would vanish entirely. The people involved must either be important enough to evade capture despite deceiving the association, or powerful enough that being caught wouldn't matter. Shin told Dojin he was now certain that he understood the basics, and that the people they were up against weren't ordinary. There had to be a reason the association lied to the families of the guild members, including Dojin's. Perhaps someone among them couldn't accept the truth. Hearing this explanation, Dojin said he understood that if he reported what happened in the dungeon officially to the association, people would get hurt. If that was the case, he had one more question. Dojin asked Shin why his abilities didn't match his D-rank category, and why he was hiding. Shin said that explaining in detail would take too long, but revealed that until a year ago, his ability was useless. He could only create 1 or 2 swords, earning him the rank of D, a source of shame. However, during the accident in the unconfirmed dungeon, he awakened his new ability at the brink of death. Thanks to that, he was the sole survivor. But it was clear that his story seemed unreal and highly suspicious. If he were in someone else's position, he wouldn't believe it either. Yet, with the truth and the main culprit hidden, his plan was to reveal everything to the world and to the victims' families. Still, Shin admitted that this didn't justify hiding the truth. Bowing his head, he apologized to Dojin, saying that one day he would find the person responsible for Hyung's death and wanted to do it as quickly as possible. Seeing this, Dojin told Shin that finding those responsible might be impossible, and that he shouldn't act as if the burden was entirely his. Excluding the fact that Shin wasn't the culprit, Dojin admitted there was no acceptable answer for him. As he walked away, Dojin told Shin that now he wasn't any different from him. Even after seeing the truth with his own eyes, he was forced to hide it from those who deserved to know. But Dojin vowed he wouldn't stop until he made those responsible for Hyung's death pay, and that he would find them, no matter who they were. He made it clear to Shin that until then, he would be under his care, and despite everything, from that moment on, they could only rely on each other. That afternoon, in an abandoned warehouse, Dong-hae had been teleported to the location. Frustrated and enraged by what had happened, he vented until Yunran arrived. She mockingly remarked that she didn't know who he was talking to, especially since saying such things after being clearly defeated and fleeing was pathetic to witness. She added that it would have been better if the executor had returned either dead or alive, but rendered useless because in that case, she could have used him as a sacrifice. Dong-hae didn't take kindly to Yunran's comments, but she didn't care, continuing to taunt him. She told the executor not to cower because the one they served still had high expectations for him, even if she didn't understand why. The priestess handed him a strange creature, and Dong-hae, puzzled, asked what it was. Smiling, Yunran told him to eat it, explaining that the child would become his new arm. Dong-hae scoffed, calling her an elemental master and refusing to eat the bizarre thing. The priestess acknowledged the lack of trust between them but asked what he planned to do now since being picky only worked when someone was in a position to act. She pointed out that even though it wasn't his dominant arm he had lost, missing an arm could still be a significant disadvantage. Seeing her partner's irritation, Yunran commented that she didn't know how much losing an arm would affect him since she didn't use swords. However, she suggested that he could overcome it with effort, since he was so demanding. Dong-hae eventually took the creature and threatened that if anything happened, he would take revenge. Yunran replied that if he could, he was welcome to do so. The executor consumed the creature and was overwhelmed by unbearable pain as his arm began to regenerate. Watching the transformation, Yunran remarked that the new arm suited him better than she had expected, and that she had thought it would take all night for him to recover. She warned that this was only the first form, and that over time, the creature would adapt into a shape that fit him better. If he didn't like it, she said he could tell her, as the child was like a son to her, and she could adjust it as needed. Amid the excruciating pain in her words, Dong Hai resolved to defeat everyone, starting with Yunran, then Tai Han, and Dojin, who had severed his arm, and finally Shin. The next day, at the airport, Hisu and Taihyun were waiting for a flight. Hisu remarked that it seemed like a celebrity was arriving because of the cameras and reporters everywhere. Taehyun corrected her, explaining that it wasn't a celebrity, but a hunter from the Hyunmu Guild, one of South Korea's 3 largest guilds. Hisu said she had heard of them but wondered why they were flying in if they were from the same country. Taehyun replied that the news he had read stated they had recently received a special invitation from the United Kingdom, likely related to a very dangerous and challenging portal. The reporters grew excited when the guild members arrived, eager to ask Hyein, the Hyunmu guildmaster, how she felt after the successful raid in Dawn City, as rumors suggested she had received a significant payment from the British government. However, Hyein walked past them without responding. Her assistant Aryam stepped in to block the reporters, informing them that no interviews were being given at that time and that their questions would be addressed later in an official conference. Once they left the airport and were inside the car, Aryam informed Hyein that she had cleared her schedule until the following day and reminded her of an interview with the Sanha Guild representatives at 11 in the morning. She also mentioned that 2 days ago, there had been a trace of the executor. This revelation startled Hyein, who immediately asked Aryam where it had happened. The girl explained that it happened in a dungeon where there had been an evaluation error, in Bupyeong. According to witnesses and the guards at the portal, someone arrived after all the other members had entered the dungeon, and their appearance matched existing descriptions of the executor. Furthermore, the association reported that there were 2 survivors. One was a B-rank assassin, and the other was a D-rank support. Hyein was surprised to hear there were survivors, especially a D-rank support. She questioned how someone like that could have survived against the executor, and wondered if the assassin's abilities were extraordinary. Aryam admitted she wasn't sure about those details and said that, for now, both survivors testified that the group's deaths were caused by an accident during the hunt. This intrigued Hyein, who began to question why they hadn't mentioned the executor. She speculated they might be allied with him, or had been severely threatened to ensure their survival. With growing doubts, Hyein instructed her assistant to schedule a meeting with the 2 survivors, as she was curious about what they would say. At home, Shin was researching information about users of greatswords in the Hunter Association's records, but, as expected, found nothing. He had some theories. First, the executor might not be an official hunter. Second, he might usually disguise himself with a different appearance. What Shin could confirm so far was that this person was linked to the annihilation cases in unconfirmed or misclassified dungeons. Additionally, the existence of unconfirmed dungeons might be orchestrated by the organization the executor belonged to. This theory aligned with the case of the mansion where Beth was. The executor could have killed all the hunters there, including Taehan. Based on their skills and potential, those hunters could have become future heroes, and their deaths would have been a significant loss for the world's future. Shin closed his computer and concluded that someone was forging dungeon ranks and sending assassins separately. This also suggested the possibility of assassination attempts outside dungeons. While Shin was reflecting on all these events, he received a call from an unknown number, but decided to answer. It was Yuran, who invited him to go out for a meal. That evening, at a restaurant in a high-rise building, Yuran was waiting for Shin. When she saw him, she remarked that she had expected him to wear something more formal, given the venue. Shin replied that he had never imagined himself in a place like that before, but now found himself increasingly concerned about the direction society was heading. He also noted he hadn't expected his address or phone number to be publicly available, especially not in the association's registry. Yuran feigned ignorance and asked if Yihyuk had reached out to him, commenting that it was obvious he had, probably with a greedy smile and unwarranted confidence. After saying that, the priestess reassured Shin not to worry, as she wouldn't say anything as dull as what Yihyuk might have. She explained that she had invited him because of a personal interest. She asked Shin to sit down, offering to buy them drinks. Shin responded that this wasn't the type of conversation where he could enjoy a drink and said that if she didn't have anything specific to say, he would leave. Yuran revealed that she was curious, as she hadn't seen the end of the dungeon due to fainting and wanted to know what method Shin had used to defeat the vampire. She noted that even with Taehan observing the situation, Shin wouldn't have stood a chance alone. Shin replied that she should ask the swordsman, not him, since he was just a D-rank support with no combat abilities. All he did, he said, was use the remaining energy he had to create a sword. That was all he knew. Yuran, smiling, said she understood but now wanted to know what Shin had to say to her. The protagonist thought for a moment and replied that, as absurd as it sounded, it was funny. A crazy psychopath wielding a greatsword was on the loose hunting hunters. The priestess, after sipping her drink, asked if she could be the next target of this psychopath. Shin responded that, if his guess was correct, the mere fact that she had entered an unconfirmed dungeon made her a target since, among all the hunters, she was the only one not affiliated with a guild. Hearing this, Yuran commented that, in that case, everyone would now aim for her, because she lacked the protection of an organization. That scenario seemed plausible. Then she asked if Shin wasn't forgetting something important. She stood up and told him that while he thought about it, it wasn't just her who was unprotected. There was also a D-rank support who, like her, wasn't in a guild and was far weaker in combat. If this was all true, she said, it was he who was in a dangerous situation. Seductively, Yuran asked what Shin thought of her protecting him. Shin turned and replied that he had already done everything he needed to and was leaving. But before departing, he urged the priestess to take the situation seriously, as her life might be at stake. With that, the protagonist left the restaurant, leaving Yuran alone. She picked up her phone and called the executor, instructing him to do his best because this was an opportunity she had secured in exchange for favors. She ended the call by calling him a disgusting rat. Smiling, she thought about how entertaining it would be to watch the fight. As Shin walked down the street toward his home, someone behind him spoke, saying it would be strange to say they had missed him. The voice remarked that, despite knowing little, they recognized his courage, as they wouldn't have expected him to still be walking alone at night after everything that had happened. It was the executor, Dong-hae, standing behind Shin. After saying this, Dong-hae asked if Shin was a brainless idiot, warning him that yelling or trying to escape would be useless, as he was already trapped. Yuran, observing from atop a building, activated her skill, Dark Territory, creating a barrier that ensured no one outside would know what was happening within. Shin, unfazed, remarked that until either he or the executor was defeated, not even an ant would escape the barrier, and that wasn't such a bad thing. Dong-hae was stunned by the protagonist's calm demeanor. Shin continued, explaining that the barrier didn't just block entry, it created a virtual space that mimicked reality. Setting aside corrupted mana, he was already concerned because he couldn't sense any presence within, which led him to suspect that everyone there had already died. Turning to face the executor, Shin said he was relieved to see how capable Dong-hae was and how organized the group he worked for seemed to be. Dong-hae questioned Shin's sanity, but the weapon creator replied that he had been expecting this, knowing he would be targeted, perhaps even tonight, because, as someone had pointed out, he was the perfect target. Furious, Dong-hae retorted that a support who couldn't do anything on their own had no right to say such things. He drew his sword and launched an attack. An explosion erupted, and Dong-hae was shocked to see that Shin had created a sword to block the attack. This astonished him even more, as the strike he had delivered wasn't an ordinary one. Many combat-class hunters would have died instantly. Dismissing his sword, Shin remarked that this was the first time in a year he could fight without worrying about witnesses. While he might still be a support who couldn't act alone, he wanted to test if that was truly the case. As Dong-hae moved in for another attack, Shin activated his skill, Spatial Grid. Outside the barrier, Hyun arrived in her car. After getting out of the car, Hyun couldn't see any sign or indication of a portal, but she could definitely feel the corrupted mana in the area. Hyun's class was Santa, a high mid-tier support class that typically uses divine power in addition to regular mana. Divine power is considered the direct opposite of corrupted mana. As a result, some Santa classes might not be able to use corrupted mana, but they can sense it. Ariam asks her master if they should report this to the association, since there was a sign of corrupted mana in a residential area. Hyun responds that, for now, no. She grabs her weapon and tells Ariam that if she doesn't return or make contact within 30 minutes, she can report it to the association as she said. Hyun activates her skill and begins walking toward the wall where she was sensing the corrupted mana. Ariam, watching her, marvels at how Hyun had sensed something coming from a simple wall, but is shocked to see her master begin to pass through it, disappearing before her eyes. Ariam steps closer and realizes that it wasn't just Hyun's appearance that had vanished, but her presence as well. She couldn't sense her anywhere. Now Ariam was silently hoping nothing too serious would happen. On the inside of the barrier, Shin was in the midst of a fierce battle with the executor. The protagonist used his skill to control swords, making them attack from a distance, forcing Donghae to defend and dodge attacks coming from multiple directions. Donghae, growing tired of it, muttered that those tricks wouldn't work, but he was taken by surprise when he realized there was a KM-38 mana grenade behind him. This was a weapon used by the military to fight against giant monsters. Shin was controlling the grenade and made it explode before the executor could dodge. Watching everything unfold, Yuran admitted to herself that she had been wondering what a good support could do to even make Elizabeth bow her head. But now she realized that Shin was definitely an opponent who could give her trouble. While the weapons he materialized weren't anything extraordinary, just simple and sharp. The reason they were impressive was because you could only demonstrate special skills while holding them. These weapons needed to be created with durability in mind. What Yuran found remarkable about Shin was that he was using the weapons he created not just to throw them, but with speed, angles, power, and rhythm. This was enough for even an experienced executor to struggle. Moreover, the protagonist also materialized firearms and had a good sense of when and where to use them. This showed that he wasn't an extraordinary creator by default, but his application and use of skills would have been impossible without the experience of a true fighter or someone at a veteran level. Watching the fight and drawing these conclusions, Yuran wondered how someone so skilled had remained hidden all this time. Shin watched the executor, now dragging himself through the smoke after being hit by the grenade. The protagonist knew that mana bullets weren't very effective against monsters above rank C, but the same couldn't be said for humans, as their strength and toughness were completely different. Not to mention, being attacked from behind a low guard didn't help. Seeing Donghae's condition, Shin remarked that he didn't even want to imagine what it felt like to be hit by such a weapon, and asked the executor if he was ready to give up. Furious, Donghae began insulting the protagonist, to which Shin replied that he had only asked out of courtesy. Donghae prepared to defend himself as he saw multiple weapons pointed at him. Shin clenched his hand, controlling the swords to launch a multi-strike attack, creating a massive impact. Despite the dust hindering his vision, Shin was surprised to see that the executor was still standing. It was then that he noticed that Donghae had transformed into something monstrous, his arm having completely changed shape. This even left Donghae confused, not knowing what was happening. Yuran, who was watching, began to control the creature that the executor's arm had transformed into. She said that there was nothing she could do and that she didn't want to do it either, but since her colleague was in danger, it would be the right thing to help him. However, had she known this would happen, it would have been better for gathering information. The priestess ordered the creature to give its best, transforming the arm into a weapon. Shin, observing the executor's condition, had already found it suspicious how his arm was now functioning. After all, it had been torn off, and now it was perfectly fine. But the level of corrupted mana was too strange to ignore. The weapon creator didn't waste time and attacked again, throwing a large sword at Donghae, who had now turned into a creature. Using his arm as a weapon, he sliced the sword in half while simultaneously launching a long-range counterattack. Shin reacted quickly, creating a shield to defend himself, and in that brief moment, he came up with a plan. Yuran admitted that the battle wouldn't be easy for the support class anymore, as materializing strong weapons wouldn't be enough. Now, she was curious to see what Shin would do. The protagonist pulled an item from his pocket and remembered that it was a gift from Hisu to celebrate the contract with the guildmaster. This was an item Shin had been searching for in the land of Arachne. When he opened the box, Shin realized that it was the bloodstone of Arachne, which contained the final screams of the boss monster Arachne. After consuming this item, the user would inherit the same class as the last person to land the final blow on Arachne for 1 minute. The abilities and rank would also match the user's. However, once the time limit expired, the user would lose 99% of their remaining stamina. Holding the item in his hand, Shin admitted that he never thought he would use it, but now, seeing his opponent, he recognized he had no other choice. As he swallowed the stone, the executor charged into an insane attack. Shin stood still, extending his arm to the side, and just as Donghae was about to strike, the effect of the bloodstone was activated. Shin materialized a sword and blocked the attack. Now, for the next few minutes, Shin's class and rank were the same as Taehyun's. The executor, now a monster, couldn't understand how the weapon creator had defended his attack. Shin, after creating and wielding the sword, felt the sensation of having a combat class, as he had blocked the attack easily. With little time left to end the battle, he said, "Now the second round begins." He then activated the explosion skill, making the sword burst into flames. Yuran was stunned, seeing that Shin was using the same skill as Taehyun. She deduced that the item he had swallowed must have been for a temporary class change through an affiliation item, the Bloodstone. Now, his physical strength and energy were temporary, but it was clear he had gained something significant. The priestess was even more intrigued by the weapon Shin was using, as she could feel corrupted mana emanating from it. Yuran began to wonder if the person she served might have given this power to Shin, as there was no explanation for how an ordinary hunter could use corrupted mana. After the raid at Beth State, the protagonist had 0 corrupted mana left. However, the small amount of corrupted mana contained in the Bloodstone of Arachne wasn't lost by Shin's skill, mana absorption. While inside the barrier, Shin activated his passive skill, absorbing 100 corrupted mana and adding it to his 20 accumulated mana. With this, he activated his demonic weapon creation skill, using the 100 corrupted mana to summon a weapon from the demon realm. Once the process was complete, the Fragorok demonic sword was forged. Now, Shin had to seize the moment. Shin launched into the attack, using his explosion skill to strike the executor, who managed to block by locking the sword with his arm. However, after that, he was dragged away, growing irritated. The protagonist didn't stop and attacked again, but Donghae managed to defend. Now close, the two engaged in a sword duel, with Shin using all the power at his disposal. Yuran, observing how the weapon creator fought, concluded that something was off. Despite Shin's class change, she wondered what had happened to his skills and movement proficiency. It almost seemed like he had been using a sword for a long time. The priestess's questions were reasonable. The Bloodstone of Arachne, while allowing a class change, didn't grant experience or proficiency. Moreover, in Shin's previous life, he hadn't been a warrior, so it would make more sense for him to have no combat experience. However, this was precisely why the Fragorok demon sword could shine. Compared to Leviathan, the weapon used by the guildmaster earlier, Fragorok was a step below in destructive power. Yet, unlike Leviathan, which specialized in firepower, Fragorok possessed the unique characteristics of a demonic sword. As Shin fought, he admitted that he felt as if he were in a trance. His senses and consciousness were intact, but it wasn't him controlling his body. Even the desire to strike seemed to come from the sword itself, a demonic sword that invades its user with its own will. Ironically, at that moment, the weapon was the most compatible with its user. After landing a strong blow on the executor, Shin made him lose sight of him. Now faster, the protagonist positioned himself behind Donghae and landed a precise strike to his back. Shin deactivated the skill and saw the executor on the ground, but he began feeling the effects of the bloodstone. With no strength left to hold the sword, he let it fall. He then felt intense pain, realizing the time granted by the bloodstone had ended. Kneeling, he noticed the executor was back on his feet. Shin knew that based on Donghae's condition, just one more hit would be enough to end it. When the executor charged again, the protagonist tried to create another weapon, but was surprised by a powerful light shining down on his opponent, rendering him immobile. Seeing this, Shin deduced that the energy was divine power, meaning there might be someone else inside the barrier. Hien approached Shin from behind and asked if he was the Shin she had been hearing about. She said there were many things she wanted to ask him, but that now wasn't the right time for a conversation. Noticing Shin's injuries, she told him not to move, as she would ensure the executor wouldn't escape, as he was trapped by divine power. Suddenly, Donghae returned to his normal state, no longer a monster. Seeing himself kneeling before Shin and Hien, he began to scream, asking the priestess what she had done to his body, leaving him in such a dire situation. The master didn't understand why the executor was calling out to someone, but he was desperate for Yuran to do something. From afar, Yuran declared that she had no choice and created a guillotine, placing her partner in it. No one understood what was happening, including Donghae, who, before he could ask anything, was decapitated. Shin and Hien stood stunned, seeing the executor's body fall to the ground. Yuran approached and remarked that it wasn't so surprising, but that she hadn't expected it to happen this way. However, Donghae had proven himself utterly useless until the end. Ripping off a nail to use one of her abilities, the priestess said that now she had disposed of the useless part of the executor. Hien then commanded Yuran to kneel and put her hands on her head, warning that any movement from her would result in her demise. The priestess finished pulling off her nail and began laughing. Seeing that Yuran wouldn't stop, the master used her skill to try to stop her, but was surprised when the woman said that she was truly frightening, and that this was divine power. If Chaos had been hit by that, she would have been defeated on the spot. Inside a protective bubble, next to the executor's body, she mentioned that it was good she hadn't been hit. Hien, seeing the bubble, couldn't understand where that divine power was coming from, but this meant there was someone else in the area besides Yuran and the executor. The priestess said that she was going to finish up for the day, as she had already given orders to Donghae, but wasn't planning to waste energy on a fight that her master had not commanded. However, when she came back, she would dress the executor in something much more glorious. She then used her teleportation skill to leave the area. Hyein was left surprised by everything that had happened, but now she was standing next to Shin, who had passed out. The next day, the protagonist woke up in a room, alarmed because he had no idea where he was, not knowing how he had been carried when he was unconscious, or how much time had passed. But he was feeling surprisingly close to his peak condition, even though he should have been bedridden for a week, unable to move a muscle. Yet, he felt renewed. However, he noticed something was restraining his hands, and he didn't know what it was. Hyein entered the room and told Shin that she wasn't sure about his condition, but had done the best she could. She asked him to let her know if he felt any discomfort or something was wrong. The protagonist replied that he thought everything was fine, but first, he wanted to thank her for helping treat him, though he wanted to know why he was being restrained. The master sat down and said that from that moment on, she wanted them to answer her questions as honestly as possible. Hyein wanted to know why Shin was with those people, and if he answered her question, she would answer any of his questions in return. The protagonist, already surprised that the woman knew his name, decided to share what he knew. Shin didn't need to know her name to recognize the woman in front of him. Hyein was an S-class Santa, widely known not only by hunters but also as the leader of the Hyunmu Guild. For the protagonist, this was a problem in itself because of the memories he had from past regressions. The Hyunmu Guild wasn't one of the top 3 guilds, and the concept of the 3 major guilds had somewhat faded in his past lives.
If you enjoyed this video, subscribe to the channel, hit the bell icon, and like the video. Thank you.